And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas from already tonight. Of course, tonight I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I'm leaving on a jet plane. Don't know when I'll be back again.
Mm-hmm.
Well, President Trump's plane made an unscheduled stop tonight for electrical failure, quote unquote. But I don't see this as a good sign. And it's been in the air, and some people have thought about alternate methods beyond the typical assassination plot from July 13th that they tried to pull off with Oswald like flair and the incredible Secret Service failures involved in that, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, and the root of the Secret Service stand down and how the Secret Service interfaces with this agency that we've been looking at called the Continuity of Government Group. And the overlap between these two is starting to open up in a deeper and deeper way. So this is going to be absolutely fascinating. I got to tell you, as far as the ideas from tonight, you're going to be exchanging pretty deep ideas. There's not going to be a lot of recipe swapping on this one. It is, or drink recipe swapping. This one is going to leave you in quite a state because some of the research is absolutely visceral and opens up many, many doors. And I don't say that lightly. Of course, tonight is the Dark Journalist special report. This is Secret Service stand down, the assassination revealed. I'm going to show you the roots of some of these characters that were involved in the stand down, and also track the sort of deep state influence on this, going all the way back to the Kennedy assassination directly into the Trump assassination attempt, which I believe is a program that's ongoing and therefore in a very dangerous place as far as our political system is concerned. I think the better we track this now, the better off we'll be. And right in the heart of it is the continuity of government group, the Doomsday Network, quote unquote, in their secret mystery communication system. I want to mention that we're going to be taking your questions as well in the second part of the show. Now, we're going to set it up to do about 90 minutes with you tonight. And we're trying to get as much of it that we can get in, but this is going to be ongoing through the month of August, of course. And before I go any further, Miss Olivia, how's the temperature out there?
Temperature is great. Everybody is very enthusiastic.
Fantastic.
Hermes was right, says, yay, this is a great way to spend a Friday night. And Bo Krill says, I can't wait. It's my birthday and I get a live DJ show. Let's go.
Well, that's great. Wow. Bo Krill. I think Bo Krill's was there for the first X Series episode. So happy birthday, sir. I hope it's a good time. And, the date gets very interesting as well. There's a lot of August dates that I'm going to plug in tonight, which are very, very strange. But I'm going to take us to a very unusual place tonight, which is Fort Holabird, to get to the origin of this overlap of Secret Service activity and COG activity. And I'm going to go through the figure of two characters, one absolutely pernicious and deep in the system. And you're going to find him showing up in the Kennedy assassination. You're going to find him showing up throughout the Eisenhower administration. You're going to find him showing up during Watergate. You're going to find him showing up as the leader of Penzoil. You're going to find him as the top of a space agency. This character is quite remarkable, and I've been tracking him for many, many years. He's passed away now, and that is Louis B. Sims, who is actually known to history as the person who handed over the tapes from President Nixon's secret taping system during the Watergate hearings. It's credited often to Alexander Butterfield, but Butterfield only oversaw the process. Of course, we've covered Butterfield before and a lot of mysterious things there, but nothing compared to Louis B. Sims, who has the very unusual item in his background of being the person who helped put Abraham Bolden, the Secret Service agent, in jail for a false bribery charge that he was later cleared of and pardoned. And it is through the eyes of Secret Service agent Bolden that we get a better look at Sims and also his international connections through Interpol. So this is going to open up quite a window, and we're going to see the COG people piloting the modern Secret Service apparatus. And that's where we got the crooks Trump situation. Quite remarkable indeed, and not to be missed, as it were. Before we go any further, I want to mention, of course, that we have a free newsletter, and I want to recommend everyone go there, especially if you're new here, to darkjournalist.com and sign up for that newsletter. It keeps us in touch through the massive censorship. And of course, I've had everyone from SEO experts to my computer pals over the years here recently looking at the censorship. And the censorship, since the election year has kicked in, has gone off the charts. And but you're also seeing this incredible clampdown, like we saw with the Muslim riots in the UK, and them penalizing in the UK system of justice all these people for tweeting things. And that is the hallmark of a totalitarian society. So that's where you draw a line in the sand there, and they need to use their system legally and public protest to the maximum to make sure that they push that apparatus back. And of course, they're planning on doing it here. And I recommend every means at our disposal on the judiciary front, on the election front, and on the public pressure side to make sure that those people understand that in this country, speech is free, and you're not going to create scenarios where you suddenly get to. And of course, during COVID, they attempted that, and they tried it with the vaccine piece and all the rest. But what I'm sensing now is that this 2020 style censorship is coming back. And it's very interesting. I can go through a whole history here for you, but I'll give you this as a nutshell, which is there was a Bilderberg meeting in 2022 and then in 2023 in Davos that said, hey, we're losing the public. We need to do things to regain trust. That's when you saw figures like Jack Dorsey coming out and saying, JFK was right. Damn those CIA people, after he, with Twitter, interfered in the 2020 election by blocking the Hunter Biden laptop from coming forward. And we had the 50 phony intel leaders from the past coming forward and saying it's Russian disinformation, which turned out to be totally false. And we all know that now, but the media doesn't care, right? But anyway, guys like Dorsey are a good example because originally they sent him in and they said, you have to make sure that this election goes to Biden. And he did that. And after he did their bidding, then everybody realized a lot of these people were on the take. And so they take the same guys like Dorsey behind closed doors and they say, you have to regain trust. And then those guys come out and say, oh, we'll smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces, quoting JFK and stuff. And, so you have a lot of corrupt people on the tech side. And it's very, very interesting because, there's been a lot of sloppy reporting overlapping that stuff just to Trump's pick of J.D. Vance and all that. The Kamala Harris ticket with Tim Walz is one of the most corrupt pieces of election of any party as far as nominees I've ever seen in my life. This is one of the worst tickets ever, and it would destroy America completely. So that's part of what we're going to discuss tonight too. Yeah, there's more coming out about this guy. There's an awful lot of false claims about his military, bravado and all this stuff. And then it turns out he was never in action anywhere. So, and so it should be enough to just say I did National Guard service because, that's valuable on its own. But he had to amp it up and use it as a tool in his political career. Now he's getting outed for it. I wonder if this guy is going to make it to the finish line. I really do. Tim Walz's administration spearheaded efforts to cut most age requirements for genital surgeries on kids. That's who you're dealing with there. Okay. So this is not a normal playing field. So when you have people in, independent media, of course, the traditional media will push this guy hard, but when they do it on the independent side and they're trying to equate him with JD Vance, because JD Vance was involved with Bitcoin or some nonsense like that, it's not equivalent at all. And so watch out for that on the independent side with this phony anti-Vance thing while they let, Waltz slip under the radar, who is one of the most radical and really completely anti-free speech. And his estimation of free speech is anything that the government deems misinformation you can't say. That's where he's coming from. What I'd like to do is send him a copy of the Constitution so he can go and read that. But this ticket has to be defeated, and the only group that can do it is the Trump administration. There's been a lot of things going around. There was a phony report that really set the internet ablaze, and even some of Trump's surrogates bought it, that Joe Rogan had endorsed Bobby Kennedy. He has not. As a matter of fact, it was so convincing that Bobby Kennedy thanked him for it, and then Rogan had to go online and say, "No, I haven't endorsed anybody." And so that was all a mistake and a misunderstanding. And it's very important because a lot of people, let's say in that, Twitterverse world, who hold themselves out as political intellectuals, whatever, like Brett Weinstein and all that, they've done good things around COVID, for sure, but they don't get this political thing. And so when they talk about Bobby Kennedy, they don't get that there's no path to victory. And I favor a lot of the policies of Bobby Kennedy, and I helped bring him out as a candidate and everything else. But at this juncture, now that they have, deposed Biden and they've shot at Trump and all the rest, there's no room in this equation for loss. There's no room for defeat on this. Either Trump gets in or that's the end, pretty much. If you have Waltz and Harris in there, there's not going to be any more future for America. That is for certain. So it's very, very important that the emphasis be laid around the ticket winning. And again, some people were like, well, they don't like Trump, or they're not convinced, or whatever, or he has JD Vance. This is a problem. Look, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That's got to be the thing going forward. You cannot have what's going on in this country with the borders and with all the policies that we're seeing continue, or else we're going to be in real trouble. The only people who can stop that are the Trump administration, and Trump getting in could stop a lot of that. So it's absolutely crucial. It would be nice if you had a candidate like Bobby Kennedy and there was a flat playing field where he could win. But any political expert, and I've looked at many, many elections, you need 270 electoral votes to win. There's no way around that. And Bobby can't get any electoral votes on this map the way it is. As a matter of fact, after they chose Harris, interestingly enough, his margin thinned out dramatically. So Bobby looks like a very important and potent candidacy for 2028. So wait for 28 would be the slogan there. There's literally just no chance on that. So when I see that floated out there the way that it was, what it'll do ultimately is, you have basically a throw the bums out vote. The opposition vote right now needs to get rid of this regime, and they cannot split the opposition by some people voting for Trump, some people voting for Bobby. It's a terrible idea. And there's the squeaker, and then, Harris gets in with the psycho Waltz, who wants to give a 10-year-old the ability to remove their genitals, without the parents' permission. I mean, it's insane. And, this is a guy, while we're seeing all this crackdown on free speech in the UK, who wants to go even further in America and say, well, free speech doesn't cover misinformation. Well, you're talking about what the government deems disinformation, and that is any kind of opposition. So we have to get real about that. And I have to say, as the election gets closer, the stakes become higher. And the way that this election is set up, there's no party that can solve this situation. But one thing we do know about the Trump candidacy is that President Trump, as president, locked up the southern border very heavily. That's what we need to happen. It's really that simple. So absolutely crucial going forward. And that's why we're seeing so many attempts to remove him as well. And I think for a lot of people who say, well, it's nice to sit and hang out and just criticize the political process, I understand and I get it. This isn't the election to do it at all. So the whole walk away thing doesn't fly for this one. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Secret Service Standown, Assassination Revealed. We're going to go deep tonight, and I'm going to try to weave in a few things that are going on now in terms of the political situation into this as well. But I'm going to take us across time to 1963 and fast forward here into 2024 and the election here to see what these two things have in common and all the deep events that have gone on in between. there's that arc of history that we're tracking. We're going to take your questions in the second half of the program. And of course, Miss Olivia will be putting those together. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
John Matthews says, what will Trump need to do to get the momentum back in the campaign between now and November?
He's got it. Look, he's got tons of momentum, and his poll numbers are good. August, August is unusual in a lot of ways politically. Typically, campaigns kick off for Labor Day. That's just the way it goes. People are away in the summer. Kids are not even back in school. There's all kinds of things. So it's really the focus comes back in, and they've already lined up debates. Trump took a week off from doing his big rallies, and everyone was like, what's going on? But in fact, Trump has all the issues on his side. He has to be disciplined with the message and hammer home the economy and the border, and he will win. Now, the danger is in the dirty tricks, of course, on the Democrat side, and that's the deep state assisting them. And we've already seen them trying to take a shot and assassinate this president. So, and remember, it's the deep state operating. You can't say, it's the Democrats try to shoot the Republicans. It has nothing to do with that. There's a deep state operational structure that we need to be aware of. And I'm using some quotes tonight from Professor Peter Dale Scott. For those of you who've watched the X series know that I rely a great deal on Professor Scott's research and insight over the years. Of course, we've had him on the program multiple times. And through many conversations, I've gotten a much broader idea of the political structure. And I've been reading his stuff since college. So it's sort of deep in there in the way that I look at things. And it's funny because I mention this often because there's so many different sides that you can go down, so many lanes politically and everything. But so many people who you would think are kind of on the right about things would appreciate what Professor Scott has said. As a matter of fact, I think he's laid the groundwork for our understanding of the deep state, and he's completely a left coast professor. There's no question about it. He's a classic liberal, and that's what we need, which is the best of the classic liberals with the best of the conservatives to form a kind of a new center. And for the invasion of the neocons and the globalists, and this very, I'm referring to it often as a superstructure. I think that's the way we need to understand it. I'm thinking of a lot of terms don't quite grab it. Superstructure really does. And certainly the deep state is operational on that. So we're going to get into some of those players on the deep state tonight. And we'll take your questions, like I said, in the last half hour. And in the meantime, what else you got?
Joseph Farrell said it's the 50th anniversary of Nixon's resignation yesterday. Nixon was the first use of lawfare.
Oh, wow. Well, this is the thing, of course. That's when Nixon resigned under pressure for Watergate. We have Watergate aspects throughout the presentation tonight because this character that I'm tracking, this Louis B. Sims, who's involved, as I said, in all of these deep events, has a very deep pivotal role in the middle of Watergate. But we also find him recommending people like Donald Rumsfeld to the Nixon administration. And we're going to see him heading up Penzoil when he leaves. And when I go into the history of Penzoil and you find the crisscross with Zapata, it's going to blow us all out of the water. But the real mind blower tonight is going to come to us through Fort Holabird and some of the extraordinary things involved there. I'm going to actually start off with a few unusual things about the July 13th attempted assassination on President Trump, supposedly by Thomas Matthew Crooks. Now, I believe there was a network assisting and getting ready to eliminate Trump there, and they just threw Crooks into the middle of it. And I think he was programmed and controlled. And I think he was built up for this for a while, I think, from looking at his past. And I think that apparatus on the continuity of government side was controlling the Secret Service to stand down through the interface of Homeland Security. And there are people who are starting to wake up. I've been out here swinging a flag to get rid of the Department of Homeland Security for a while. And I'm starting to see people catch on to it. Now, Homeland Security has now moved up to 260,000 employees. Now, just think of that spread out across the country and completely operational. And what we know about them is they're run by this Alexander Mayorkas, and they've allowed a completely open border situation, but they have built up a database of Americans to target and surveil. So they're acting as an extra constitutional force the way the CIA did. What's interesting is the CIA had tremendous influence and has tremendous influence, but they are, we're still talking about 25, 30,000 agents. This apparatus that continues to grow over 250,000 people is a huge problem. It's a huge expense. And it was brought in with the Patriot Act. It was brought in with all the 9/11 junk, which was a product of the continuity of government because they activated COG during 9/11. So somehow COG has to enter into the conversation, but it has to enter in correctly and not floating in on somebody's fantasy about what COG can do, but really on the fact ground aspects that we know. And that's why when we bring forward that COG piece, I think it's so illuminating. Couple of things came forward about Crooks. First of all, some of the audio was released from law enforcement that was engaging him early on because all these people, of course, saw him on the roof about to shoot President Trump or pointing it out to Secret Service, who didn't seem to care, and law enforcement people who were like, what is going on here? And at one point, these law enforcement people jump up on each other's shoulders and look across, and he actually points a weapon, or whoever that is up there points the weapon at them. Now, it's interesting because they take off at that point, and then the audio goes dead. But later on, as we get audio back from the event, we hear about a guy with a flat face who was creeping up on people during the Butler rally and who disappeared running into the woods. Now, that's a second person that we're hearing about. The flat face thing is interesting because of, when we think of the actual look of Crooks, he also has a very unusual face. But a couple of things came up. Would-be Donald Trump assassin Thomas Matthew Crooks, this is from the New York Post, practiced firing rounds at his local gun club dozens of times, including on Christmas Day. In the lead up to the rally attack, newly obtained records show the 20-year-old dedicated about 80% of his time to rifle practice during his slew of visits to the Clarendon Sportsman Club in Pennsylvania, according to records released by Chuck Grassley. He focused almost exclusively on the rifle range throughout 2024. Now, I've pointed out before with Lee Harvey Oswald, they did the same thing. He had all these appearances at rifle ranges, so it looked like he was gearing up to really, shoot the president. And at one point he wanted to, be so noticed that he started shooting on the target of somebody else who was at the range. And when they complained and he said, well, I thought I was shooting at President Kennedy. Sorry, my name's Lee Oswald, by the way. So this kind of setup, like what they're doing with Crooks here, is interesting. Of course, originally they said he was part of this rifle shooting class. And the person, the teacher of that class said, no, he never showed up for that. He might have showed up once or twice, but he wasn't part of it. And, so there was a lot of discrepancies right off the bat there. A number of unusual things about Crooks, as we've been pointing out in a series of reports, but this one is grabbing me because I think we're looking at doppelgangers throughout. And I think when you get into deep state situations, their utilization of doppelgangers is something that they call a legend inside of intelligence circles. That is, to place different people there who look exactly the same so they be identified. In this case, what I found weird, an FBI spokesperson said investigators successfully accessed Crook's cell phone and continue to analyze his electronic devices. Now, I want to tell you something, that the Secret Service director who quit, Cheadle, and then her replacement has come forward saying, oh, we couldn't see this and we couldn't see that. And don't worry though, we're gonna get high tech. We'll get some of that surveillance equipment. They have the most advanced surveillance equipment. in the 1980s, they could look, and it's a part of Senate testimony that got out, they could look underground in the Soviet Union in parking garages and read the license plates.
Wow.
So this is 40 years later. So the Secret Service can see everything. They use thermographic technology, they use satellites, they've got it all. So any of this, oh, we couldn't see it, reminds me of the phony COG commander, Van Herk, saying, hey, those balloons got through because all of our sensors at NORAD weren't set up to detect balloons. Wouldn't you know it? Shucks. And Van Herk did it with a straight face. But this whole thing about, oh, everything's fixed up now, and as kind of an excuse for this is beyond ridiculous. They tracked every person. They have facial recognition, doing records. They have fusion centers processing this at all times. So the kind of surveillance that they do in a city situation without a rally going on is remarkable. There are cameras everywhere, and they are tracking cars, they're tracking faces all the time. So the idea that the Secret Service couldn't see this guy, or he moved into position without them seeing him, is completely a joke. And the other thing is that supposedly the agents who were in the building that had the view of the roof, that they both got called away. And guess what? Their car didn't work to get back into the building in time for them to see him. Just really ridiculous. After they had already seen him and reported that he was out there. In those types of situations in the Secret Service and in law enforcement, you don't leave your post. So this is highly unusual activity, highly unusual behavior. No, those people weren't fired. Yes, in some cases, the people who weren't fired are actually writing the reports themselves. So the dumb reports that we're getting are from the people who were lax in the first place, or were they lax, or were they under instructions not to do certain things? This is where we're going to get into something very important, which is called the Sphinx Code in Secret Service. And I'm going to tell you where the Sphinx Code comes from. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Secret Service Standown. Assassination revealed, in this case, the July 13th attempted assassination by Thomas Matthew Crooks against President Trump. Of course, it's alleged because we don't actually know that that was Crooks there who was doing the shooting, although they made great pains to make it look that way. There's a good deal of research that says that there were 3 shooters involved there that day. And of course, we did have a fatality in the crowd. For those who like to minimize the shooting or to say it was staged in some fashion, all your credibility goes out the window. I don't know. I've seen even halfway decent. It's such a kind of a knee-jerk reaction, I think, to just say everything's fake around the alternative and independent circles. Those people that have pursued that have made themselves look ridiculous, and you should always, of course, look at every event and make sure that, it is what it appears to be. In this case, the problem is they're trying to say that Crooks got on that building and that they couldn't control it and that he got those shots off. Now, the problem is that the shots that were fired at President Trump most likely did not come from Crooks, and they were coming from somewhere else with a sharpshooter, and it just so happened that Trump moved in the middle of all that. And also, some of the people who were shot in the crowd who lived, even though the wounds were severe, they were taking, if you go back and look at those stories, they were taking video. They were taking pictures of the spot where Crooks would have been. So whatever it was, they didn't want us to see. You have to shoot at that person. It's very much like the story of Gordon Arnold in the JFK assassination. He's there, and they try to chase him out of the grassy knoll area before the shooting, saying you can't be there. But then he shows back up and he's shooting, shooting video, and they're shooting guns. And at a certain point, he hears the bullets behind him, and then he hits the deck, and they run up to him and start beating him up and take his camera away. That's part of making sure you have your Patsy story locked and loaded so that people can't take this other evidence and use it against you. That's something to keep in mind in this case. All right, New York Times. Before Crooks became infamous for attempting to kill a former president, he was a student at Bethel Park High School who had graduated in 2022. He didn't submit a senior photo. This is a problem immediately. Why wouldn't he submit a senior photo? So already we're dealing with issues of recognition, facial recognition, and resemblances. According to the yearbook for that year, although he's pictured in yearbooks from other years. So, I'm going to go very far here, but did they take the person who was Crooks, basically, and he removed from the scene, and did they replace him? Let's just think about that for a moment. I'm going to read you some very unusual testimony that goes back to the Warren Commission, which, by the way, is coming up to a 60th anniversary in September. And I'm going to show you why that's not such a far out idea as we look at this case. And of course, this is Thomas Crook's computer technology course, where he says, and I quote, "Hello, my name is Thomas Crooks. I'm currently in the 11th grade at Bethel Park. I've always had an interest in building things. In 2017, my dad and I built our first PC, a gaming machine with a motherboard and radio and R9 graphics card. We later modified the case to include the glass side panel and RGB lighting." Basically, you had kind of a tech geek here who was basically kept to himself and was not particularly popular in school. He was ideal and may have been selected very, very early on. Of course, his appearance in a BlackRock commercial and things of this nature are just unusual breadcrumbs along the way. All right. Going back to the Kennedy assassination, there's a character in there that a lot of people don't talk about. His name is John Pick, and he is the half-brother of Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, I've pointed out two things that I think are crucial, and I may actually do a show on one of them. But what I've pointed out before is that there are multiple stories of Oswald in other cities. And they aren't fly-by-night, hey, I saw this guy hanging out in a diner. They are, I lived beside him for years. One of those cases is in North Dakota, where a family lived next door, and a teenager befriended Oswald. And they had the whole thing set up with Oswald and his single mom, Marguerite. And they had the name switched around, Harvey Lee. And Harvey Lee was obsessed with leftist communism and all this kind of thing. And there's a scene where he goes to the library and they don't have a Marx book, and he flips out and the police have to drag him out. So there's a record of this Harvey Lee being dragged out of this library. It's the North Dakota Oswald. It's a very unusual story. No one knew what to do with it, so it was just left there. However, the people who got in touch and gave the story, completely reliable family out there who said they live right next door to this guy. Keep that in mind as I give you a couple of facts here. John Pick was the child that Marguerite had before she had Oswald. It was from a different father. A couple of interesting things here, which is Oswald's father was a third cousin to Teddy Roosevelt. Have you ever heard that?
I didn't know that.
It's quite unusual, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what are the odds of that? John Pick had some interesting things to say about Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald, when he was questioned by the Warren Commission. And of course, Pick had been in the Air Force himself. And so he was under some heavy questioning there when they were trying to get some answers out of him about Lee Harvey Oswald. And I think as a way to get rid of the doubles question, they were asking some questions about some things that were coming up about Oswald's appearance. Listen to how Pick answers. Mr. Jenner is the lawyer asking him the questions for the Warren Commission. Quote, when you saw Oswald next, he was 23. Mr. Pick says, yes, sir. So Oswald was with him when he was a teenager. and they grew up early on together in the same house. But then when Marguerite went to New York, they actually lived together for a little while. But he hadn't seen Oswald in a number of years. So they're asking him, did you notice a material change physically? First, let's take his physical appearance. Pick. Yes, sir. Physically, I noticed that. Mr. Jenner, what did you notice? Mr. Pick, that he was much thinner than I had remembered him. He didn't have as much hair either. Mr. Jenner, did that arrest your attention? What was that a material difference? Did that strike you? Mr. Pick, yes, sir. It struck me quite profusely. Mr. Jenner, what else did you notice about his physical appearance that arrested your attention? Mr. Pick, his face features were entirely different. Being his eyes were set back, maybe, like in those army pictures, they looked different than I remembered him. This is his brother, his half-brother, who he lived with growing up. His face was rounder. Marilyn had described him to me when he went in the Marine Corps as having a bull neck. It's another relative of theirs. This I didn't notice at all. I looked for this. I didn't notice this at all, sir. Mr. Jenner, so he seemed more slender. Well, he sounds like he's talking about a totally different person. Mr. Pick, yes, sir. Mr. Jenner, he had materially less hair. Mr. Pick, yes, sir. Mr. Jenner, and you're saying his eyes looked a little sunken? Yes, sir, Mr. Pick says. Mr. Jenner, did he give you the appearance? Was he taut? Was he relaxed? Or just did he appear in that? How did he appear in that connection? Mr. Pick, sir, he didn't strike me as being relaxed because I was not with him. Mr. Jenner, you were not? No, sir. Because of the other feelings we had developed 10 years prior to this, I wondered about how he still felt about that. There's no explanation for that, but obviously some hostility there in the family. But nothing, Mr. Jenner, but nothing occurred to lead you to believe that he was still remembered it vividly, or did or didn't. Mr. Pick, when he was introduced to my wife again, he did mention that he remembered her, but other than that, he completely ignored her. And so this unusual conversation goes on. The key thing is, think about having a half-brother, and it's true that Oswald spent some time in an orphanage when he was younger, which is where I think he was originally discovered by a lot of the intelligence groups who wanted to use him. But Pick lived with him when he was in New York, and Marguerite, was the mother of both of them, and he would see him back and forth even when he wasn't in New York. Here's this guy saying, well, he didn't look like the same guy to me. Now, the Oswald doubles and all these kinds of things, we know that they used doubles to create this impression of Oswald. Even J. Edgar Hoover in 1960 is warning about this and saying someone's using his identity way before he's anyone. And that's the top man at the FBI who's writing memos about him. It's quite extraordinary. So they're trapping him and tracking him very, very deeply. The question is, Pick is seeing the person that they're showing him now and saying, this guy, there's pictures of him in the media, there's all this other stuff, and he's saying it doesn't look like my half-brother. That's pretty strange. Now, we know that Oswald had a very defined look in that throughout, even when they're showing photos that seem to show him heavier or lighter or whatever it happens to be. Generally, there's certain characteristics that you can see that make you think, well, it's still Oswald. There are a few that are different. And also the fact that Oswald speaks such fluent Russian that when he meets Marina, she thinks he's Russian. You have to be incredible in order to fool a native Russian that you speak Russian, that you are Russian by how you speak. Think of how good your accent and everything else has to be, and how someone coming from Oswald's background doesn't really have access to that kind of training, except in the army where they trained people to go over and to speak to Russians. They had a whole language program. So that's where he got a lot of that training. I wanted to mention also that in talking about the location, when we get into what happened in Butler, that when you look at the Texas School Book Depository as a location, you find a lot of the same unusual anomalies are involved here, which is that how he was placed in the location is unusual. With Crooks, we have him showing up in 3 different ways. We have him showing up in a car, we have him biking, and we have him, in this connected to this van with Arizona plates that they dragged off and no one talks about anymore. And there was witness testimony about the van immediately that said the van parked in front of my house, and that's a place where no one usually parks. But because there was an event going on, I thought, whatever. Later, they found the van full of explosives and dragged it off. And we know that there were trigger devices with Crooks. So whatever they were up to here in terms of laying out the scene, something seems to have gone awry with the fact that the shot missed Trump, and then the follow-up plan seemed to go awry. And it did happen in the Kennedy assassination. They were able to pull off the assassination of the president, but the cover-up of Oswald and the scene of the crime went, shall we say, awry. And remember, we think of this as just the government controlling the whole scene. It's one aspect inside of these secret agencies of the government, and so therefore they're not infallible. And that's a crucial thing to keep in mind as we go forward here. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Secret Service Standown, a special dark journalist report, Assassination Revealed. And it's an arc of assassination throughout time from 1963 to the attempt on Trump in 2024, and the forces that operate that would give you a security stripping stand down from the Central Intelligence Agency and the Secret Service. This has to be understood as part of an arc of doing business over a long period of time and controlling policy and outcomes, et cetera, including elections. And we see them really moving on that front now. I'm entirely convinced that most of what we're hearing about the shooting in Butler from the Secret Service is completely untrue. And that's a very, very perilous situation for us. And the more that they come forward to try to say, oh, don't worry, we're going to use tech and all the rest. Like I said, they have access to the most sophisticated surveillance equipment that would blow your mind. And of course, many things that we don't even know about. The idea that they couldn't track this kid is a complete joke. So now how can we get into something that's real about a deep state operator who was operated in that system, deeply associated with the Secret Service, who has this kind of fingerprint on him of intelligence deep state work? And I'm going to go through the character of Louis B. Sims, and then we're going to go through another agent because that agent will be directly connected to the continuity of government. And what's interesting is I found him describing how he was recruited, and I think that's going to help us a great deal. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, so Scott NYC says white van owned by Urich's dad, Arizona plates, and T. Oliver says that van is. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I just want to say that Urich is the Crooks lookalike, and he was grabbed originally. We don't know what they did with him yet, or he's not in the picture.
I think it's crazy that we haven't had an update on him.
Yeah, the other thing is there was a crazy thing that went over the top that tried to track the van to some Urich family in Arizona, and that was it was a false investigation. So you have to be very careful in the early stages of things. Do you remember when I started the program tonight, someone said, hey, Joe Rogan endorsed RFK Jr.? It's false. It's a false story. So I have to be careful what we go over the waterfalls with. But thanks for asking. Yeah, what do you got?
Okay. Number 6 says Crooks is called out by police as a guy in white shorts on the rooftop, but Crooks didn't wear white shorts. And Roosevelt Media News says Butler County and PA State are refusing a FOIA request for Crooks's autopsy details.
Yeah, I have a thing here. I have that article about the autopsy. I'm glad you mentioned that. They're withholding it under Butler County rules, which is ridiculous.
Until when? I mean,
no, that's it.
Like forever? That's it?
Yes. And what's interesting about that is
What rules are those? Did they actually cite the rules? The supposed
Yeah, it's family. Like they do in a normal case, if somebody were killed and they wanted to withhold the autopsy, that would be one thing. See, this is weird because they don't have a criminal case against Crooks because he's dead. This is exactly how they did this against Oswald as well. Once he was gone, there were no legal things you could bring to bear. But I will say this, that because this is a federal investigation, they should have access to it, and the public should demand to see the autopsy. One, to see what drugs they were using. Two, what shot was it that actually shot Crooks? If you've seen the visuals from the roof, and they are gruesome, I have some of them here, but you've seen many videos of this. But it is unusual that, um, just speaking in a general fashion, when you're a sniper and you shoot somebody, and they shot him in the head, it's going to splatter all over the roof. And what's strange is there's this weird stream that goes this one thin, uh, you know, kind of railing there where he's lying. So there's something very unusual about that as well. And I think some of the commotion in the men showing up in gray suits very early on. you know, um, there was a team of Secret Service agents in the Kennedy assassination. There's two different groups of Secret Service agents. One of the group had two red bars over a white background, and that's how they were supposed to spot each other. And they would wear that as a pin. And then another group, the secret group that's involved with the X Protect group that I follow on this program, the police were instructed that anyone who was wearing X's in their hats as part of the band of their hat was to be allowed equal and easy access and not be stopped and all the rest. So they tip people off by visual. And so the gray suit men represent a kind of highest clearance. So if they show up on something, you give them your materials. So if somebody is tuned in to the way that the Secret Service has set this up, they just show up in the uniform and say, hey, give me this photo or whatever it happens to be. So there seems to be some of that involved in this case. More and more as it comes out, the case is very confusing. And it's by design. But what they were telling us, there's a very good readout about an agent who is tracking Crooks. And he said, he's sitting, this is just before the shooting. He says he's sitting at a picnic table, and then they have him walking away and going towards a convenience store with a gas station, which is in a totally different direction. He does not have time, unless he stops on a dime, runs back. He doesn't have time to do all those things to get into position to shoot. So whoever that was somebody that the agent thought was Crooks. So you have a lot of things going back and forth here. Unfortunately, inside the Secret Service, all they're trying to do is shut this down, very much like the early FBI and Warren Commission around the Oswald case. Interestingly enough. You got another one?
Michael Horton says the FBI hosing the crime scene down is reminiscent of the Deathmobile being washed down outside Parkland within minutes.
I have that picture tonight. I think that picture might be the immortal picture of this assassination attempt, unfortunately, which is them power washing the crime scene, getting rid of the evidence. There have been a lot of FBI problems in relation to President Trump. The phony Russia investigation, all the different things. Peter Strzok. There's a number of stories going out about Strzok now that, because the government looked at his texts because of all the illegal things that he was up to, that he sued them and got paid over $1 million. So there's sick payoffs going on in the background. They want to make sure they take care of their people. So getting a real telescopic, wide-angle lens on the deep state corruption involved here is going to help a great deal. It doesn't even necessarily mean being anti-government. What you're doing, in a real sense, you're helping the government. This is the weird part, because those individuals inside of that structure are being blackmailed by this thing, and they have been, and it's been under control for a good deal of time. And that's where you get the cover-ups and you get the patsies holding the bag on the other side. So remember that as well, which is when we're exploring a good deal of these things, it's actually a great assist to the government, because for those who want to get to a genuine outcome on this, there are a few people involved in the case tracking it. Senator Josh Hawley has done some real interesting questioning of the Secret Service and others, and he got the whistleblowers coming forward. I think there are aspects in that government structure that want to know what's going on. So keep that in mind as we're going along here. It's not anti-government. It is anti-deep state, which is a totally different thing. I told you tonight was going to be a little interesting. It was going to be harder and the ideas from not to be focused directly on what we're talking about, but you ain't seen nothing yet, as they say. All right. So we went through interesting identities and stuff. And of course, we remember with Oswald that he was placed in some very unusual situations, including Atsugi in Japan, which is a incredibly top secret facility that housed the U-2. And that's where our advanced aerospace craft were. And it was a CIA-run unit. So this idea that he was just some low-level guy is ridiculous. So I think we pretty much understand that, but it's an important thing as we go forward here. Now, let's take a little walk between this unusual fort and this character, Louis B. Sims. And so Fort Holabird, where they did tremendous MK Ultra and LSD experiments in Baltimore, Maryland, and Louis B. Sims, who happens to spend not 1, not 2, but 3 years at Fort Holabird before he becomes a Secret Service agent dealing with the Kennedy detail. Now, some of the star agents in the Kennedy detail we know very much about and all the rest, but nobody ever talks about Sims because he's a background figure. As a matter of fact, he came out of the same Chicago office that Abraham Bolden was a part of, but nonetheless, he was connected to the presidential security detail. There's a few interesting things about him. One, very early on, he has a meeting with Harry Truman when he's 22 years old. And he's an Army intelligence officer at that age. Very young, selected, obviously highly talented. He will show up in the dramatic interface of all these deep events throughout history. And he seems to be the key man on the inside for a number of them. Eventually, he'll go into the business of being a big shot at Interpol. So this character is going to give us a few interesting answers, and we're going to find him in the heart of the continuity of government program. Now, before I get to Holabird and before I get to Louis B. Sims, I'm going to tell you a little story about a Secret Service agent named Katz, Norman Katz, who is a resident here in Massachusetts. And I was trying to ascertain, he would be very elderly if he was still alive. I was not certain if he was still alive, but I know that he was active as of 2013. He gave a series of interviews. And his very early recruiting into the continuity of government program as a Secret Service agent is going to be quite amusing, and a contrast to Sims, who we know is coming kind of from a dark place. With this character, we feel like he's just being pulled in, and he has some unusual things to say, but there he is, and he ends up being part of the Kennedy security detail as well. Now, and he's from Sharon, Massachusetts. So he talks a little bit about being 24 when all this happens with the Kennedy's assassination. And he says, that day I was in the office, a teletype came right through. We knew immediately. There are fewer than a dozen Secret Service agents and his associates alive from the day of the assassination, he said. He began giving talks about his experiences in 2010. Now think of the arc of time there. 47 years have passed, almost 50 years since the incident. After the assassination, by the way, this guy gets out. He goes and does other things. But at this very crucial time, he's recruited by the COG people as a very young man and put into this emergency planning corridor that interfaces with the Secret Service, eventually working directly with the Kennedy security detail. And he said that he checked with the FBI in Boston before he came out and started talking, and they told him to go ahead, but be careful what he shared, since some information was still classified. By the way, it's the Cape Cod Times that this article comes from 2013. He brought anecdotes and memorabilia to his appearances at the library that detail firsthand experience in White House security. He had a sense of excitement that conveys the drama of the time. I was in very often when he was there, JFK, Katz said about the Kennedy White House. You don't speak unless you were spoken to. We had a job to do. All I can say as a youngster, it was Camelot. It was really Camelot. It was so wonderful, that family. It reminds me of the family that occupies the White House today. Back to the meeting with the two strangers on campus. Now, this is how he's recruited originally. He's at Northeastern, and these figures show up, and they say, hey, we want you to do something for the government. I was about 128 pounds and a nervous wreck at being summoned. I don't know why I was chosen. These two strangers showed up, and I said, what's the problem? There was an official letter that was dated May 3rd, 1962, and invited Katz to a rather unique assignment within the U.S. Army Interagency Communications Agency. This is how you get to the Doomsday Network, the COG communications. The letter revealed little about the mysterious assignment, but instructed him when he arrived in Washington, D.C., to call a certain number and show up at a particular warehouse. Do you see how deep and secret the COG people are? You know, there's no regular trail for things. There's, hey, show up at this warehouse and call this number. Now, a little more background on Katz. Norman Katz is who we're talking about here. When Norman Katz was 23 years old, he was military attaché to the Secret Service, working in the continuity of the U.S. government program at the White House during the JFK administration in 1961. The former Sharon Selectman was an Army second lieutenant who handled communications in one of the secure rooms in Washington, D.C. in the event of a national alert. Katz would be among those who made sure the president and other elected officials were kept in contact. Now 76 years old, he would be, I think, close to 87 now if he were still alive. He sat in the basement office of his house in Sharon and recounted how Jacqueline Kennedy would always remember the roses that were given to her in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. Quote, she was delighted by the people who presented her with yellow roses in Texas, Katz said. He recalls that everywhere else in Texas, Jackie was given yellow roses, a symbol of the famous folk song, The Yellow Rose of Texas. He said that Jackie remembered, only in Dallas was I given red roses. How funny, red roses for me, she thought. Katz said, soon the backseat of the presidential limo would be strewn with blood-soaked rose petals. The 46-year-old president and his 34-year-old first lady exchanged one final glance. Going back to 1961, Katz was sitting in a history class at Northeastern when he was called to the university president's office. I said, oh my God, what did I do? Katz said, my tuition was always late. Who had money in those days anyway? Waiting for him in the president's office were two men. They said to me that I had been selected for a special position in the military, and if I would be interested, said Katz. I had already received orders for Korea, and I said, well, where is it? They said, we can't tell you. Katz recalled the two men saying, well, you know, we're not going to be able to give you that information. Well, what would I do? Katz said, we can't tell you that. I said, I'm getting married in a few months. Can my wife go? They said, yeah. To Katz, staying in the United States and being able to be with his new wife was better than going to Korea. And so despite knowing very little about this new job offer, after graduating from Northeastern, he and his wife picked up their VW Beetle and headed for Virginia. We were nervous, said Katz, but I was a kid, 23 years old. Little did he know at that point, he would not only witness the Cuban Missile Crisis firsthand, but also have an inside look within the government during a time of the assassination of a president and the consideration of emergency powers. On November 22nd, 1963, Katz was in Virginia in a secure installation where, in case of some emergency, the president or federal agency representatives of government would go in case of a natural disaster, a nuclear holocaust, for example, or the assassination of a president. On that day, because he was supposed to be in Dallas, a small group had left Washington because of the hostile atmosphere there. When Kennedy was president, there were only about 300 Secret Service agents, said Katz. Today, there are about 7,000 agents. Now, I want to tell you what's weird about this, and we're going to have to get to the bottom of it, because the recent Secret Service director, Rowe, when he was giving his exposition before Congress, he was saying that there were only 2,300. So I think this is an interesting discrepancy on numbers, and maybe that was just a slip of the tongue, but I want to get into that. So what happens when we track and follow along is we find that he is the COG interface between the Secret Service and the deep government aspect operating there. And he goes through all the different steps of what took place. And then what's interesting is in all of his bio pieces, he always put that COG part right up front, and it's Secret Service COG. And I've looked at the overlap between Secret Service and COG before, but what's remarkable is when you look through the eyes of these two characters, one Katz and the other Sims, we really open up some very unusual things. Now, one thing I want to clear up is that in the last show, I kept talking about how they removed the Secret Service agents off the back of the limousine, and there's something known as the Secret Service Standown, where the shift leader, Emory Roberts, orders the agents off the back where they're holding the rail. And the reason they did that is not just to be there, but also to act as a block in the back so someone can't shoot through them. And before you get to Dealey Plaza, they take them off. Now, they take them off in Love Field, which is unusual. And there, of course, is the video of the agent, as I described, going through this, like throwing his hands in the air, being like, "What are you doing, making me get off?" The person who ordered them to get off is Emory Roberts. For many years, it wasn't known who gave the order. And there was a false story that was floated by the Secret Service itself that said, "Oh, Kennedy didn't want them on the back," which is a total joke. It never happened. And when they went through those different Secret Service agents and interviewed them, nobody had that excuse. So that was put out as a little piece of PR. Now listen to what Katz has to say about this very same situation. Katz said if someone had been standing on the back of the car, like the car was designed for, like they should have done, then it would not have been a straight shot at Kennedy. Quote, "I don't know who gave those orders," said Katz. "To this day, no one knows. Everyone denies it." This is very compelling, and I think for someone who is on the inside, it's very fascinating because he realizes whoever took them off. Now, we found out that Emory Roberts is the one that did it. Apparently, that information never reached him, but I still find it interesting. And then, of course, he's able to recount everything that happened and all the rest. Katz's story is interesting on a few different levels. One, it gives us that interface of how they recruit for COG1 under complete secrecy, and two, the interface there directly with the Secret Service. So the corrupting element I'm suggesting here around the Secret Service over this arc of time from 1963 to 2024 is this continuity of government peace. And this is why it's not understood. And very often people will say, well, thanks to those agents who put their lives on the line. And they're right, because there are great Secret Service agents. There's no question about it. But when the structure stands down, something has happened in that chain of command. There's some aspect there that's hidden and covered up by the institution. And this is where the COG deep state players get in. That's the crucial part for us to pay attention to. And now, when we look through the figure of Louis B. Sims, we're going to understand why. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Secret Service Standown, Assassination Revealed, going deep, deep tonight into the Secret Service through the figure of Louis Sims and Norman Katz. You know, it's very interesting to me, too, because Katz seems like the opposite of Sims. That is, I don't detect anything in Katz of a sinister fashion at all. It just seems like he, his story, in fact, is a great window on how they go back and forth between the Secret Service and COG. It helps us. But what I do find interesting is when we get to Abraham Bolden's story about Louis B. Sims, we have a total deep state actor who's totally involved with Interpol, who's totally involved with oil interests, who's totally involved with the CIA. And he's at the center of all these major deep events in history, and probably the real setup of that COG interface and the manipulation of the Secret Service by those groups can be seen and witnessed through him. We're going to be taking your questions here in about 10 minutes or so, and Miss Olivia will be putting those together. You can ask them now. How are you doing out there?
Good. Golden Girl wants to know, how do you spell Katz? Is it K-A-T-Z?
It is, yeah. I'm sorry that I don't know. I wasn't able to ascertain if he was still alive because there were obituaries that had the same name, but there seemed to be different. And I can't confirm if he's still alive, but if he was alive, he would be around 88 years old. And he gave a series of interviews in 2013, 2014, and then nothing after that. By the way, he'd been off the map for 47 years up until he gave that first interview in 2010. So the Kennedy assassination, then he quits government, then boom. So I think that gives us a pretty good overview on Katz. The only other thing I will say about Katz is Norman Katz, they say here in this article that he's crucial to relaying information about the history of events that took place during the JFK and Johnson administrations. The youngest of 3 living special agents, the United States Secret Service, who served on the day of Kennedy's assassination. So he's one of the guys who's still around for this. Now, I mentioned Fort Holabird and the unusual things that took place there. That's where we're going to go next. But I want to say, for those who are seeking out Katz, and of course, it would be great to be able to speak with him if he were still alive and speaking, because he is an expert, having been in the continuity of government program and the Secret Service. But in his own bio, he describes himself as a special ops division continuity of government program expert who served during the JFK administration. Now, a couple of things about Fort Holabird and our friend Louis B. Sims. One, right off the bat, I want to say Clint Hill, who is famously known from the JFK assassination, who jumped on the president's limousine after all the shots were fired, and was Jackie Kennedy's Secret Service agent. And he's the one, who's given interviews and had books for years and years. He was trained at Fort Holabird as well. So there's a number of Secret Service people who came through that program. Some of the deepest of the deep state players came through Holabird. So just keep that in mind as we go forward here. Because Sims, you can feel the shadow just as, just while we're looking into him. So I said there was a Sphinx protocol involved. Remember me saying that?
Yes.
In the Secret Service, there's something called the Sphinx protocol. And you might wonder where that comes from. Well, the idea is the Sphinx is silent and won't say anything. So he knows how to keep a secret. Interestingly enough, the symbol outside of Fort Holabird is this Sphinx.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, that's one shot of it. Take a look at that.
Yeah.
Here's some other classic shots of it. The Sphinx. Fort Holabird and the Sphinx. Now, there was a commemoration. It was placed there a long, long time ago in the early 50s. Then it was rededicated on August 5th, 1962, which is the same date. The only thing that's unusual about that date is that Marilyn Monroe died on that day. It's just a strange overlap there. Dedicated on the 5th day of August, the year 1962, to the eternal and glorious memory of those men of the Corps who made the supreme sacrifice. Okay. That's This is the symbol for them. It's a higher ideal. But again, the Sphinx. And what's interesting is the Sphinx, as you'll notice in the first picture, has breasts. So this is a female Sphinx. I found that interesting. And from an occult point of view, it's very interesting. Fort Holabird, let's get into a couple of things here. Something unusual for me in tracking Holabird was that right after the 9/11 attacks, within 3 weeks, there was a 5-alarm fire that destroyed a number of buildings at Fort Holabird. And the news in the Baltimore Sun at the time termed the fires, quote, very suspicious. Somebody had blown those buildings up, set them ablaze, as it were. Now, in going into the history of Holabird, and I'm going to help you to make more sense of Holabird through the figure of Sims who was there, but I just want to give you a couple of interesting side notes about it. One is that if you go through the history of Holabird, you're going to find at a certain point the Sphinx disappears. It's gone. Now, you can't remove a statue like that, just have it disappear. So what happened to it? I checked around a little bit, and it was moved to Fort Huachuca. Now, Huachuca has a very unusual UFO file connection, and that's in Arizona. But here's just a little bit of a dispatch about the Sphinx. Quote, the Sphinx was moved from Fort Holabird to Fort Huachuca and took up position in front of the museum there during the remainder of 1974. The museum welcomed 500 guests, civilian and military, from the surrounding community. The museum collection included 400 items on display. So there's this museum that's at Huachuca. The museum closed on July 24th, 1976. Due to the abolishment of the museum, Curity's position was scheduled to open, and then after that, the Sphinx disappears. So there's no other trail for what they did with the Sphinx. Maybe they put it away in the basement at Rand, where they have T.T. Brown's time travel equipment. But I found it an interesting overlap or an intro to what we're going to say about Holabird. Now, let's go with this on Holabird, and then we're going to track the Secret Service overlap. And everyone, by the way, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is Secret Service Standown, Assassination Revealed. Going deep here tonight. We're going to be with you here about another half hour, and we'll take your questions here shortly. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, sign up for our free newsletter. It keeps us in touch and gets us around all the incredible censorship that we're seeing, especially in this election year. Right now, we're really deep into it, and it's gotten beyond absurd. One of my favorite things to do is to ask people inside the description section of the video here. You'll see #DarkJournalist. And when you click on that, it says nothing to see here. Indeed, nothing to see. Well, there's thousands of videos, but YouTube can't see them.
They wanted to correct you, and it's Huachuca.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's one of those kind of, I guess it's a Native American word, but it's got a little bit of a lilt at the end there. Fort Holabird. Do you want to say it again? Fort Huachuca?
It's Huachuca.
Huachuca, right. Huachuca. Okay. Fort Holabird was a United States Army post in the city of Baltimore, Maryland, active from 1918 to 1973. Holabird was located at the southeast corner of Baltimore. And now a number of things have been attributed to Holabird, which I'm going to read about. Of course, the deep LSD experiments, MK Ultra experiments, and others. But looking at its background is unusual, particularly the people who were trained there. Now, Louis B. Sims, as I mentioned, spent 3 years there. That's a long time for a facility like that. But let's look at a couple of the people. Clint Hill, as I mentioned, who's on the JFK detail. Mike Gravel, who was a senator from Alaska. What was Mike Gravel famous for? Do you remember?
I can't remember.
He was very famous for pushing to get the UFO file public. And Gravel made it a huge issue, and he ran for president twice, and in debates and things, he would bring it up. And then beyond that, he also was involved in the background in trying to get that going. There's a number of other interesting people who are associated and trained and stationed at Holabird. But the one that really grabbed me when I was reading this was J.D. Salinger. J.D. Salinger, of course, the author of Catcher in the Rye, and Catcher in the Rye used over and over again in these assassination attempts. Mark David Chapman, of course, his assassination of John Lennon is caught reading after the assassination. He drops the gun and he's just standing there reading Catcher in the Rye. They'll try to use that as a follow-up in the John Hinckley Jr. shooting, and they'll say, oh, he was obsessed with it. But obviously, it's very important to have Salinger deep into the middle of this. And it's interesting because as I was going along and thinking about Salinger in relation to what I'm going to tell you about Lewis B. Sims, there's a real crisscross here. A Sphinx guarded the entrance to the headquarters at Holabird in the 1950s and 60s. The Sphinx, a composite creature with a lion's body and a human head, is often represented in ancient art. This is part of the description from the history on the fort. In 1923, the War Department selected the Sphinx as the symbol of the newly established Military Intelligence Officers Reserve Camp, an association created to foster professionalism among officers with a background in intelligence. The Sphinx was selected because it was a heraldic symbol of strength and wisdom. For a number of years, the Sphinx was associated exclusively with Army counterintelligence. The Counterintelligence Corps and School and their successors, the U.S. Intelligence Command, U.S. Army Intelligence School. In 1953, a 5-foot-long Sphinx constructed of pot iron and painted gold was placed in front of the Counterintelligence Corps headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland. The exact origin of the statue remains a riddle. How would that be that the statue remains a riddle? There's no background on it. On August 5th, 1962, members of the National Counterintelligence Corps Association rededicated the statue and attached a bronze plate to its base at its location, Fort Holabird. So we can see there's something unusual here. If you dig into the Sphinx part when dealing with the Secret Service, it's because they're using silence, and the Intelligence Corps is using silence as the symbol here for the Sphinx. And when we get into that occult piece engaged with the Sphinx, we also know that the Sphinx is, holding secrets and all the rest, but they're also engaging with very occult imagery, and also when you become part of this, you are becoming part of the guild, as it were, the guild of the secret Sphinx. So when we're getting into what we understand is just the Secret Service, the Secret Service is a structure. And when you place people who've been trained in Holabird, which is one of the most secure secret facilities where they carried out MK Ultra and LSD experiments, and I will read about one of those. And then when they produce people like Lewis B. Sims, who's at the interface of all these deep events, we start to understand that what the deep state is particularly good at is using these structures like COG, using the Secret Service. And so they come in, but where would these people be trained in the first place? A place like Holabird was where they'd be trained to do these deep state activities, and then they could come in and take over an organization through the various weaknesses in leadership in a place like Secret Service, for example. That's the way for us to think about it, in my opinion. Yes, what do you got?
Roosevelt Media News says, I bet the Sphinx was taken from the Tartarian World Fairs, which is why the secrecy about where it came from. And George Ivankovich wants to know, what direction does it face?
That's a good question. I don't know. I didn't see that in the description, but I'm sure we can find out. I think the Sphinx is very unusual in the middle of all this, actually.
Can I throw something else in?
Yes.
Seeing in Sights says Mike Gravel said that this planet is being, quote, monitored.
Yeah. No, Gravel was deep in the UFO file. And the fact that he was there makes you wonder what he saw when he was there. No question about it. Okay. But who else was there at Fort Holabird? Our friend Louis B. Sims. And that's going to lead us into our friend Cheadle as well as we go along here. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Secret Service Standown, special report, assassination revealed. Now we're going to go to Louis B. Sims, go to your questions, and that's going to be our program for tonight. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our free newsletter to let you know about the incredible interviews that we have coming up for you, X-Series episodes that will blow your mind, coming to your way after Labor Day, and also the remarkable events that we have coming up for you, documentaries. Of course, Hacking Atlantis is the recent documentary we have up there, and just an extraordinary thing. There's going to be a 4-part series around these discoveries of Lloyd Berkner and the final speech with JFK. I'm putting those together now. And for those of you who watched my interview with Dr. Joseph Farrell, he, in his Ripple research, uncovered something dramatic that locked in directly with this research around Dr. Lloyd Berkner. And we put that on the record. It's kind of the prelude now for this series coming up. Just wait, because that's going to be heavy. That's coming up to you in the fall. So make sure you're on that newsletter list. Stand up and be counted, and don't miss it, because YouTube decides, you know what, that dark journalist is getting into things we don't want him to get into. Just forget about that. Just make sure that you're on that list, and it takes about 20 seconds to sign up at darkjournalist.com. So make sure you do it. Okay. How are you doing out there?
Good. Ogun 5 says, just how close was the ship bridge collision to where Fort Holabird was located? Another good question.
Yeah, I'd have to look at the map, but it's right in Baltimore, so it couldn't be too far. And a lot of the reports, it's very interesting. Fires. When you get around 9/11, you get a lot of things destroyed that are a paper trail to many of these deep state activities, including, of course, the destruction of Building 7. The office in the Pentagon where they were tracking the trillions that were missing, that was gone. The spectacle of Defense Secretary Rumsfeld carrying someone out in a stretcher under a terrorist attack, there are rules of what you do with the Secretary of Defense. You can't do that, and you can't let them be public. It's very interesting, because when we look at that COG overlay, we find the architects of it came directly out of early programs like these NGO programs that the Nixon administration was doing, that the CIA was moving into these other countries to monitor things. And the people we find involved there are young Dick Cheney and a young Donald Rumsfeld, directly out of that Nixon program. And these guys will weasel their way into the top ranks of the Ford administration. Of course, the only unelected president in our history. He was never elected as vice president or president. And we know that Nelson Rockefeller was his VP. So you had a very unusual situation there. Of course, there's a shot of Cheney working under Reagan and putting together the continuity of government new rules. And those new rules included, well, COGs for any emergency, not just a nuclear one. Anytime there's an emergency, we can call COG. This is the nature of the problem that we're looking at with COG. And of course, the tie over directly to the Secret Service Director, Cheadle, who is now resigned. But nonetheless, there she is. And she is the one who will take Dick Cheney directly into the COG bunker during the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So the COG footprint and stamp is just heavy duty on that. All right. But what we've been waiting for is Louis B. Sims. So let's get a couple of things. Now, this is from Jim Keith, an early observation. Jim Keith was a fantastic writer who died young, unfortunately. And one of his partners in writing passed away recently. That was Ken Thomas. And Ken Thomas told me personally a lot of very interesting stories about Jim Keith, including the fact that the very same reason of how he died in this New Orleans hospital, the technique, as it were, he was writing about how the CIA was using this technique, which is basically like kind of a water in the knee type thing to get rid of domestic enemies. So he's writing about the thing and then he dies of it. It's very unusual. And he wrote about very intense things. Keith, I think anyone who's read his stuff, Men in Black, Secret Government, he was very well informed and very articulate. And Thomas was as well. As a matter of fact, Thomas wrote the Maury Island UFO book. And, I was able to tell him what a great impression that made on me. And both of those guys, I think, are remarkable. But here's what Keith had to say about Holabird, just to give us an idea. And remember Holabird tracking it directly as a deep state conduit into the Secret Service by way of the COG program. The Army intelligence base at Fort Holabird, Maryland, was the beginning of the CIA's MK-Ultra mind control projects. Experiments in some cases copied from Dachau were performed on over 7,000 American soldiers without their consent. They were told in some cases they would be testing summer clothing. In violation of guidelines set at the Nuremberg trials, nerve gases, including the deadly Nazi chemical agents Tabin and Sarin, were used and tested on unwitting recruits, along with a host of psychochemicals, including LSD. Some tests resulting in deaths and permanent crippling of enlisted men. Among the Nazi scientists transplanted to the U.S. was the famous SS Major Werner von Braun. Factually, the most decorated of the Nazi breed during World War II, and a man who had joined the SS at the behest of its chief, Heinrich Himmler. Von Braun, who was to be head of NASA and the author of a book on the Mars project, was responsible for running the Peenemünde rocket base during World War II, where they used slave labor to build the V-2 rockets. And his brainchild, the V-2 missile, would have carried atom bombs to New York if plans had proceeded farther. So he's locating all of this program directly at Holabird, and he has the person overseeing the experiments as von Braun and his ilk. Now, in the New Yorker, there's a weird reference that I found about these two soldiers who are working in Holabird, and it's all about this person, Clovis. And so this is kind of a fragment, but I'm going to bring it in here because I think there's one interesting piece in it. Clovis joined two other officers to reconstitute a special purposes team within the Army, officers who had become terrified that James Thornwell's story would leak. In August 1962, just before this team departed for Hawaii, the Army Intelligence Command at Fort Holabird issued a stern warning, quote, "You are hereby instructed that under no circumstances will you use or allow EA 1729 on U.S. citizens anymore. The LSD experiments in the Far East, the precise countries where they occurred, remain secret. They seem to have been more brutal than those in Europe. The team chose half a dozen subjects who appear to have been either suspected smugglers, narco traffickers, or alleged spies." So they're talking about the early use, and the LSD experiments. There have been some good research and books on it, but this piece connecting it with Holabird and how Holabird is kind of where they develop MK Ultra. There's an aspect inside of Holabird which is just the deep state on crack, and it's operating without any real oversight because they want to get to the goal of utilizing these tools. So when we find people coming out of that structure, especially someone like Louis B. Sims, then we can we have a better grasp of his character level and what he's capable of. So he's 3 years, remember, in there. Sims is an unusual character, and we know him mostly through the fact that during the Watergate hearings, he was the person who had to, or did he, bring the tapes directly to Judge Sirica. And they were the tapes that were under his control of Nixon and the various things he was doing. So this is where he shows up and we get to know who he is and all the rest of it. Otherwise, we wouldn't know a great deal about him, very much like E. Howard Hunt. Now, I'm going to read a couple of things about the tapes, and then we're going to read just a little bit on Sims, just a background. Louis Sims, U.S. Secret Service agent from 1961 to 1981. Sims worked a 30-day detail at the Kennedy White House and was given a variety of assignments during the weekend of the funeral following the assassination. He worked in the newly created Intelligence and Liaison Division in Washington, D.C. Now, I want to say this about him. He shows up just before the Kennedy assassination is about to happen, and he's connected directly to Kennedy's security. And it's interesting because he's the one, as I said, when Abraham Bolden, the Secret Service agent, raises questions about what was going on with their activity. It's weird because later Bolden, of course, would go on the record and say the reason that they were able to avoid with President Kennedy these other incidents, particularly in Chicago, where Thomas Valley, who was another version of Oswald, was going to shoot him with a high-powered rifle from a building and all the rest. That only got stopped because of a traffic stop accidentally, and they looked in his trunk and found all these weapons, and then they realized, but that's how they were like, oh, Kennedy has a cold, and they got him off the motorcade. That information, along with busting into a hotel room and finding weapons there, was all being fed to the Secret Service by an informant named Lee. That's what Bolden remembered. So the idea that it was Oswald is just an interesting piece. The name match is unusual there, and it's right in that window. It raises the question, basically, was Oswald an informant, or thinking he was an informant, busting these plots, and then they just dumped the plots on him? It seems quite likely. It's interesting because one of the things that Professor Scott has pointed out in relation to Oswald that I find interesting is that James Hosty is this unusual FBI agent who obfuscated all of the actions he was doing with Oswald, but he was the one supposedly who was showing up and saying, oh, I'm going to interview you, and then Oswald would show up at the FBI office and say, stop harassing me at my house and all this nonsense. But what Peter Dale Scott ascertained really was that he figured out that Oswald, what he was doing, the FBI had given him an assignment to track how rifles are ordered through the mail, and to track that whole network of how that's done and who gets them and all the rest of it, and how anonymous you can be. And they were using him in this very low-level program to track this. That's why he's coming up with names like A.J. Heidel and ordering stuff to a P.O. box. And that Hosty is the conduit, so that he has this kind of phony relationship with him, like, stop harassing my wife at our place of residence, and like, I'm not a commie and all this stuff. Well, what's actually going on is they're trading information about what Oswald is finding out about ordering these rifles. But as they have Oswald ordering these rifles and things, he's building this incredible trap for himself, looking like someone who's ordering rifles to a P.O. box that are eventually going to be used in the presidential assassination. So we have to understand that the levels that these things operate on, by the time we get to the patsy, they can be operating on a very low level. One of the things that I learned from Professor Scott's work is that the CIA will use very marginal individuals for very great tasks. And in the case of Oswald, it's fascinating because by the age of 24, he'd gone all around the world. He had lived in Russia for 3 years. And he'd also been to France. He'd been to England, Helsinki. I mean, this guy was everywhere. And very interestingly, I don't know how many of you have seen this. Let's see. There is a picture of Oswald in the Philippines in 1958, and John Wayne has gone over to visit our soldiers there in the Philippines. And who's hanging out in the back? Let's see if you can see there. That is Oswald hanging out in the back with John Wayne sitting there eating in the Philippines. I mean, Oswald had been all over this world, and it's quite remarkable how they use the patsies as well, because, of course, Hinckley and our friend Mark David Chapman, who had a minimum wage job as a security guard at a medical facility in Hawaii, had traveled the entire world. He had traveled into places that you couldn't get into in those days, like Beirut. And he'd been to Asia, and quite remarkable backgrounds. But this is how that network was operative. And of course, when it came time with people like the assassin of Martin Luther King, there's another one whose worldwide network operates him so that, you know, by the time he's busted, he's actually holding up banks in the UK. How did this low-level guy in Alabama go from being this, low-level thief and hired for an assassination, and then boom, he's showing up in the UK doing bank robberies? I mean, it's quite a network who moves him around, from Alabama to Montreal to the UK to Spain and back. And you have to think about the power and the capability of the organizations that do that. And also, when we deal with Oswald, we're dealing with an organization that was able to put him in a place that other people couldn't go, namely Soviet Russia. So it's a remarkable network, but it's not one that's often talked about. So when we think about somebody like Louis B. Sims, it becomes very interesting, because Sims, one, comes out of Fort Holabird. Two, before that, he's met with Harry Truman. Well, that's kind of extraordinary for a guy who's barely out of college. And he's used for Army intelligence very early on. When he is assigned and when he is brought in on the Secret Service side just before the Kennedy assassination, the thing that Bolden suggested about Sims and that the other guys talked about is he doesn't seem to interact with anybody else. He seems to sit in an office by himself. He's very off to himself, as if, he's working. And their idea, the other agents, their idea about Sims was very simple. They thought he was working either for another agency like the CIA or a foreign power, i.e., he was a spy. But deep state spy, I think, would be the ideal way to describe him. The role that he plays in the middle of putting Bolden behind bars after Bolden raises all these questions about the Secret Service detail is a story in itself. But just keep that little factoid in mind, that he's the one who's responsible for getting Bolden locked up. Now, Sims will show up, as I said, in these other deep state capacity. He's the guy who's going to show up in the middle of Watergate, and he's the one who says, well, I've been overseeing the tapes that President Nixon has been making, and I'm willing to surrender those to Judge Sirica and all the rest of it. So here we have a trusted insider, very much like Cheadle, who is able to hand these materials off. And, he's the ultimate middleman for this situation when they've decided, well, you know what, it looks like we need to get rid of Richard Nixon. And it's interesting when we look at Nixon in the context of all this and think about Watergate, we're in an unusual situation, because Nixon, although he operated on a very deep level himself, he gets out deep stated by the time we get to Watergate. And the people who show up to, close the deal on him, one, are John Dean, who's working with the Continuity of Government group just before he becomes the legal counsel for Richard Nixon, the president. He is the legal counsel for the helping the Emergencies Planning Continuity of Government group. One of the Watergate burglars is also part of the COG program. So you see, you're interfacing with this deep aspect whenever you get around these events, but they change dramatically. It seems reliable over and over again that you're dealing with some aspect of the government which is completely secret. Now, I'm going to give us more on Sims here, but I'm going to start with your questions so we stay on time here tonight. And Miss Olivia, take it away.
Okay, let's start here. Ray
Yeah.
Story. So, was Richard Nixon a bad guy or not then, in your opinion, DJ?
Well, he's a mixed bag. I mean, he is a player for sure, and he was willing to operate on very sketchy levels. At the same time, he didn't want to. He thought that he was president, and we know that certain things that he did. For example, he didn't. The Rockefeller forces wanted to go for GATT and NAFTA, those types of things, back during his presidency. And he was like, no, that's not going to happen. And so there were a number of things he resisted them on. But in particular, when he saw these hearings coming up around the Kennedy assassination, he brought in Richard Helms, who's the director of the CIA, and he said, when it comes to the whole who shot John angle, I'm willing to protect you, but you need to let me know exactly which operations were utilized in the assassination. He is saying, I'll offer you my protection, but he's also getting that inoculation against the CIA and the FBI. And so when Watergate starts to pick up some steam and whoever in the deep state is pushing to get rid of Nixon, he starts sending aides back to Richard Helms, and the aides say, look, he's saying if you do this, it's going to open up the whole JFK Bay of Pigs thing. You don't want to do that. And that Helms, who was a very calm, cool, collected guy, states to Haldeman, who was, this aide going back and forth for Nixon, he said, I never saw Helms get red-faced and lose his marbles the way he did, screaming at the top of his lungs. I have nothing to do with that. So they knew that Nixon had the goods on the Kennedy assassination. And it's very interesting because there's a whole battle that goes on there. And it starts with LBJ trying to blackmail Nixon with what they have. But then Nixon going back and saying, I know your involvement with the CIA and the Kennedy assassination. So the double blackmail situation that's going on brings us into Watergate. And it's interesting, 50 years after Watergate, that they still have very pat answers like, oh, guess what? It was a call girl operation. That's what they broke in there for. Let me tell you, no, it has nothing to do with anything like that. The story, and, in some of the observations of Robert Merritt, who was deep in the Watergate program, I had many, many conversations with him. He was part of the Houston plan. And what he told me was very interesting. But one of the key things that he said was Carl Schaffler was the one who was feeding the information. He'd been placed by the CIA in the police intelligence unit. And that the whole thing of, them discovering some burglars there, the whole thing was orchestrated. And that Schaffler was their deep state inside man. So when we want to get to the truth of Watergate and all the rest of it, remember at the end of the day, the CIA people were like, hey, it was a call girl list. We wanted to get that call girl operation. That is not the reason for Nixon to risk his entire presidency sending those people in there. It's totally different. And it's interesting too, because somebody had to be working on Nixon's ear to get that to happen in the first place, because it takes place in June of 1972, and he's looking like the odds-on favorite to beat McGovern. So why was he so nervous? Well, what's interesting is there was an aide to Howard Hughes, who was now working with the DNC and who had worked with Hughes and Nixon earlier. And the idea was, according to Hunt in private talking to Caddy, he said that they had the JFK assassination Cuban intelligence files, and those files revealed the fact, about Oswald working with the government and all the rest of it. So there were a lot of problems there. And the idea was that this could be used to embarrass Nixon and say Nixon was part of Operation 40. Operation 40 turned into part of the JFK assassination. These were the records that they were breaking into Watergate to get. And they were sending one of the people involved in, and that was E. Howard Hunt. He was running the whole thing. Now, it looks like whoever set that piece up on the CIA side double-crossed everybody because Hunt would go to prison and Nixon would get deposed. So it's a very, very deep operation. And don't let them fool you with any phony, flimsy excuses about Watergate. It was the ripples of what they were looking for and why they sent people in and why they got caught are extraordinary. But remember two things. The pivotal people involved, John Dean and one of the key Watergate burglars, were both COG people. Yes.
Najat Madri says, with a certain cast of characters, it's not about if they are good or bad. They're operating an infrastructure that is impossible to manage under normal circumstances. So it's the central banking warfare model.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, what's interesting is it's also comparative, because you think it's interesting in a conversation I had with Professor Scott about Nixon. He said, we all were totally against Nixon. He was the epitome of evil for us. We would have done anything to take him down. But in retrospect, we had to realize that he actually had done a number of things that were progressive for the culture, like setting up the EPA and trying to get us off the oil paradigm, all these other things. So, it's interesting how we view it, that you can look at somebody, in this environment, for example, you could take the policies of JFK and they would say that they were hard right-wing policies, So it's interesting how the pendulum shifts so dramatically in relationship to that. Yes.
Okay, back to the Sphinx for a minute.
Yes.
Old as Dirt said the Sphinx faces east.
Okay.
And the Drunken Scoundrel said the Key Bridge.
Wait, you mean the Fort Holabird Sphinx?
Yes.
Okay.
And the Drunken Scoundrel says the Key Bridge is access to Fort Holabird Park. To answer that other question.
Oh, yeah. Okay, excellent. That's a good point. I think there's something with the imagery of the Sphinx piece. I'm going to read you a little excerpt about the taping system, because this is going to give us more open doors around Louis B. Sims. So I want us to keep in mind, as this kind of interface, we can kind of go through the deep state through this character. President Nixon had been routinely taping all of his conversations and meetings in the Oval Office and cabinet rooms of the White House, in the Executive Office building, and on 4 of his personal telephones. Former White House aide Alexander Butterfield, also a major deep state player, was told the Senate Select Committee yesterday that this was the case. Butterfield, now the Federal Aviation Administration administrator. That's good. Let's say that all at once. Federal Aviation Administration administrator. Whoa. Said the tape of the recording began in the spring of 1971 and was intended to record things for posterity. Sure. For the Nixon Library. Most participants in conversations with the presidents did not know they were being taped, Butterfield said. And because only a few of the members of the White House inner circle were told about the several hidden recording devices. Butterfield's testimony, acknowledged to be correct by the White House, indicates that the White House may have in its possession the means to prove that President Nixon knew nothing about the cover-up of the Watergate affair until March 23rd, 1973, as he has maintained, or that former White House counsel John Dean was correct in testifying that Nixon knew about the cover-up well before March 21st. This is an article from the period of Watergate, and it's interesting because you can see Dean is the ultimate player to take down Nixon. But it's strange because he's Nixon's lawyer. So, using your own lawyer against you, that's not easy. You have a client privilege and all the rest of it. So something right off the bat is quite fascinating. And it's interesting because Dean's wife will be the roommate of a major DC madam. And Dean's wife will also have worked in the COG group. So we're getting, instantly you get this kind of incestuous thing going on around COG. Now, sources inside the White House said, however, that the president was expected to stand by his most recent statement. So this is the crucial thing, and it is Butterfield who's testifying to it. However, the tapes are overseen by Louis B. Sims, and Louis B. Sims will be the one who will actually present the tapes to Judge Sirica. He's the one who says, okay. Now, so we have these deep player personnel right in the middle of Watergate as well. What's interesting to me is that Butterfield is often given that title, as it were, of being the person who was involved in that. Now, what will happen as a reward, I believe, for Louis B. Sims' activities, both in the Kennedy assassination and in setting up Bolden and in helping make Watergate stick, is that he gets to be the leader of Penzoil. Remember Penzoil?
Yeah. Doesn't it still exist?
That's a good question, but Penzoil certainly is one of those kind of major, kind of like mobile type companies. Just a little bit about the background of Penzoil. Maybe we can track some individuals through this. The origins of Penzoil can be traced to South Penn Oil Company. Oil business started in Oil City in Pennsylvania as a unit of Standard Oil. Okay, so Standard Oil is Rockefeller. So this is a Rockefeller unit. It becomes the largest oil producer in the region, becoming independent when Standard Oil was split in 1911. By those times, two companies, one on the East Coast and another in the West, started to market their motor oils under the brand Penzoil. Their refineries and distributors were later incorporated as the Penzoil Company. In 1955, South Penn Oil acquired complete ownership of Penzoil Company. In 1963, note the year, South Penn Oil merged with Zapata Petroleum in Texas, in Houston. Now, who do we know was at the helm of Zapata? And that's George Bush.
H.W. Bush.
Yes. And what's interesting, of course, is the code name for the Bay of Pigs was Operation Zapata. So the deep Bush will go on to lead the Central Intelligence Agency. So this crossover here between big money, the oil companies, and the CIA aspect is clear. But right in the middle of it, we have, when they're dishing out rewards, who's getting the big rewards? It's our friend Louis B. Sims. And I think there are interesting things to go even deeper on with Penzoil. I'm going to leave Penzoil for now just to get us into the last part of this. And I want to remind everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Secret Service Standown. Assassination Revealed. Going deep tonight into the deep state aspect surrounding the penetration of the Secret Service and through the figure of Louis B. Sims. And also, it's quite interesting to me because I think when you take a character like Sims, you have to always see what is that background, and that Holabird background, that major key sitting in the middle of all this. And also remember Bolden's testimony about Louis B. Sims, that this was a guy in the figure of Sims that was distant when he joined that Chicago office. He was on his own, and people thought of him as an operator, either for the CIA or a foreign country. And when you look into his past, you'll see he gets promoted into Interpol after his dealings with the Kennedy assassination. So here's somebody who's interfacing on an international level. And as we see him move through the deep state, it's fascinating that by the time we get to the later part of his career, it's Penzoil. What's interesting is he gets grants from the space agency to start an aerospace company. That's the next chapter in his life. So I won't take us into that whole piece, but I think when we look at Sims, we have to remember there's an aerospace connection there as well. And when we look at the level, the lengths to which the deep state is after Trump, the Get Trump campaign, let's not forget that very tight relationship, which I revealed on this program as far back as 2017. That's the amazing thing. And at the time, it wasn't really talked about much. And I said, well, there's a series of letters. He got him an office, an apartment, all these other things. And generally the reaction was, well, Trump had this one letter where Nixon predicted he was president. And that was it. And then in 2021, the Nixon Library released over 300 letters of correspondence between the two. That's a pretty tight relationship. Yeah. Go ahead.
Wally Tango Foxtrot. So why the war obsession with Iran, Venezuela? Oil, of course. The new greed deal is misdirection. Inside joke as the New Deal was also their creation.
I think the oil paradigm, just like the tech paradigm is taking over now, the oil paradigm has been the rule of the land. And I think that the kind of Exxon Mobil, Rockefeller, that whole thing is moving into the green energy scam. And they're moving into it, say, since the 1950s or 60s. It's been a long arc. And they've run into some really big problems about controlling these different regions for things. But that same oil paradigm that they've kept us on, where they've suppressed the technologies for more advanced energy or exotic technology to take care of so many of the problems of energy in the world, this is a small group not sharing those types of advances. And also, when we get into people who've done the breakthrough energy work, those inventors, those engineers and things have come forward with it, very often, a lot of them, their careers are interrupted or they're killed. So, we have to think of the way that this works. It's very interesting, too, the way we think of these structures. And I use this example. So if you've heard it before, forgive me, but I think it's a crucial one. The way to think of how the deep state operates through the Central Intelligence Agency is take a place like, I don't know, Uzbekistan. And there's a number of oil companies who want to start refineries and things there. But they're worried that a strongman will show up and take over. And so they'll lose all their profits and access and all the rest. So they go back to their CIA friends in the deep state and they say, here's what we want you to do. Create a political uprising, put our guy in, and then we'll be able to move in. And so this is something I think we've been able to understand. There's been enough time. We understand that level of corporate control. The fact that it runs through the government and that a number of things that we do, for example, in Ukraine, in Afghanistan, and other places, are driven by those types of profits, whether it's drugs or minerals or oil or all the rest of it, is something that an average person, is distracted so often by these other things, identity things, oh, hey, what bathroom are you going to use? And they take you off into Alice in Wonderland while they're doing all this stuff in the background. Well, that's how you get that central control grid. The question is the control grid, what is the end goal of the control grid ultimately? And if you're frank about it and you take an honest look through the lens of deep state research and secret space research and UFO research, what you find is that the goal of the whole thing is to control what goes on Earth from space. So you have a very small group that controls things from space, and on Earth, you basically have a controlled slave population.
Elysium.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Mhm.
But it's interesting to me because the space part is missed a lot. So I've often said that the deep state researchers, the deep state world doesn't understand the UFO researchers, and the UFO researchers don't have the depth of the deep state researchers. So it's understandable that there's a split there, but there's a big advantage on the UFO side, even though you get a lot of bozos in that field, because what you do have is an understanding of the UFO file. You see that it exists, that there's a piece there that's not accepted in ordinary understanding. And so that's a major piece of information. And so if you leave the UFO file out when you're doing deep state research, you're missing a lot of it. Remember, I attribute the Kennedy assassination and the series of assassinations around it to the aerospace aspect, directly over the UFO file, aerospace piece. The people who investigate on a deep level, it was Jim Garrison's ultimate conclusion. He thought It was the aerospace wing of the military industrial complex working with the intelligence side. Those are the aspects that he pointed to. That's exactly how I see it, which is it relates directly to this area. And what's interesting is a lot of people don't put that into, say, someone like Jim Marrs' plate. And it's interesting because I had a number of interviews and great conversations with Marrs when he was alive, and he was an extraordinary figure. But I've got a quote for you from his book Crossfire, where he mentions very deeply and seriously how the Oswald connection around NASA is the crucial linchpin in the whole piece about understanding who Oswald is. I'm going to read that to you, and then we're going to take your last few questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Secret Service Standown, Assassination Revealed. We've tried to look through a couple of different figures here tonight to get that interface between Secret Service and COG clear in our minds, and looking at this, and also to understand the assassination attempt against President Trump and how it's being covered up in real time. But a number of things are coming forward about it anyway. The patsy they gave us in Crooks does not, their official story does not add up at all. We have people who resemble Crooks or someone with a flat face, figure that one out, running into the woods after the assassination, reports of others running behind the water tower. There's a major operation involved in removing Trump, and they missed him by maybe an inch. So the fact that they did actually hit him, that they missed the fatal shot that closely, that's how close we came as a country to being in a totally different setup. And I do think that, as we're talking about the season of assassination, unfortunately, I think that we're still in it. And I want to mention this in relation to the election that we're in the middle of right now. What they've done with the Harris-Walz ticket, is gone very extreme. So it's a very extreme ticket. And the way that they're trying to present it, they did a New York Times article where they were like, hey, Walz likes dad rock and all this kind of stuff. Walz is in favor of sex change operations for 9-year-olds. That's on the record. That's who you're dealing with. And
how about letting cities burn to the ground?
Yeah, he's a psychopath who is, they're trying to appeal to the everyman. All you have to do is look into his background and his record, his open record, wanting to ban free speech, and his actions during the BLM riots. The whole thing. He is to the left of Kamala Harris. So
well, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Around that. So if when they steal the election, will they then be able to say they have a mandate from the people to go hard left? Is that the idea?
I guess it's if they were to steal the election, because I don't believe, under the normal circumstances, you see the economy is terrible, in fact, and it's harder and harder to hide. Last month's jobs report was 0 job growth. There's no job growth. So you have high inflation levels, 0 job growth, and then the Fed is in a bind, because if they approve of cuts, then they look openly favorable to the Biden people. And Trump did an interesting thing, is he warned them 2 weeks ago, don't do it. And they're looking at him and thinking, oh, there's a possibility he might get in. We have to stop that. But if he does, and we do this cut, then, that's the end. He will get rid of us. So I think that was a very interesting shot across the bow from Trump. Trump did a very interesting press conference yesterday. And I think a few of the things he put across, if he can stick on that message of bringing back this kind of financial economy well-being for the nation, and if he can stick to that message of sealing the border, then Trump will definitely win. The thing is, with the types of numbers that Trump could win by, I don't think they can fix the election. So I feel that's why they're so determined to remove Trump. So the plain activity today plays into that, in my opinion, as well. I'm going to read you 2 quick things, and then we'll take your last couple
Sure.
of questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show, Secret Service Standown, Assassination Revealed. If you're new here, I want to remind you, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. It's free. It's free. And what does it do? It tells you what's coming up, the incredible shows we have coming up for you, guests you won't believe, out of this world, documentary series. The documentaries we have coming up for you this fall, mind-blowing. Incredible X series episodes, and then events. All these things right there in your newsletter. You don't have to count on any particular social media network, although we're happy to see you there. And but make sure that you get that directly in your inbox. That's a free newsletter, and it keeps us connected. It's that kind of guarantee that we're going to have this pipeline that doesn't require the assistance of the uncooperative Google network, shall we say. Does that make sense? I'll take your next question.
Oh, I thought you were going to read something.
I am, but
Okay. Well, Butterfly Effect Group says, have there been any whistleblowers to this deep state penetration of the Secret Service? And David Tormina says, DJ, which element of the deep state do you suspect had the biggest motive to take out Trump?
Yeah, well, look, they've been trying to remove Trump since before he got into the presidency, once he declared himself. They had Russia, of course. You might remember some weirdness involved with his inauguration where he had Marines running around in the background. And, you had these recent statements now from a congressman saying if Trump wins and they bring that down to Congress, we're the ones who are going to stop him there and say he's not eligible. The Supreme Court didn't do it, but we will. And the Trump people will just have to go home. And he goes, then you'll really have to hire security and it'll be civil war conditions. The Democrats and the control of who's controlling the Democrats, there's a crazy lust for remaining in power, one, but also making sure that Trump does not get back into office. I've pointed out that his association of his political mentor, Roy Cohn, and how he got into things gives him the same keys as the deep state players. So he has the keys of someone like a Louis B. Sims. But through his uncle, he has the direct connection to the UFO file. So you have those things there. So if you're a researcher and you're looking through it with the eyes of the X series and Dark Journalist, that's what you're seeing. If you're looking just from the deep state level, you can say, well, Trump's a billionaire. He has his own set of policies. He's an America firster. He's a Fortress America. He doesn't want global empire. The group in the deep state that are supportive of Trump would be the patriotic group. And that same group, at some point, Professor Scott identified it to me. And it's the American, they used to call them the American manufacturers aspect, the American manufacturers group. They were very interested, for example, in controlling the hemisphere. So, Central America, South America, and that whole thing. They weren't so much interested in wars overseas. They aren't interested in a Ukraine war. They aren't interested in World War III with Russia. They come from a different strain. And Trump has that level of support from those groups. And, certain levels of the mafia, for example, are associated with extreme patriotism. This is very interesting. It's one of the reasons why there was a huge crisscross with the mafia helping the CIA. The whole thing was to keep the communists out. So these are echoes that you need to track over time and see how this has become the nature of the system. But the thing that's trying to move in and invade now is so anti-human. They're making the big play. It's the same group of neocons trying for World War III with Ukraine in Russia. And so there's a level of insanity, the kind of Davos level of insanity of the WEF group. And it was funny because they were trying to, this is what happens online a lot. I really want to point this out. They moved this video around and it was Trump actually, right after he got into the presidency, and he went to Davos, which all the presidents do that. And every follow-up for Davos, he didn't go to because, there was criticism back and forth and all the rest of it. So they floated this video out, obviously the Harris campaign or somebody, and they were pretending, they were like, oh, Trump goes and meets with the WEF people, and look, he's there with Klaus Schwab and his daughter's there. And instantly you can tell this is footage from 2017, So you're going to see a lot of these things where they don't date things, they don't source things, and things are run over a cliff. And you're going to have to be very careful in this election period, just like, the phony Joe Rogan endorsement of RFK. It didn't happen, but there we had RFK accepting it, saying, thank you, Joe. And then Joe saying, I didn't endorse you, So there's a weird thing that just like, if somebody says it, it's true nonsense. I remember this was going on with Biden when they were saying, oh, he's dead. He's dead. We're sure he's dead. You have to be careful. You got to be really careful. It was weird the way that they were doing things. And they were keeping him out of the public eye until they could, turn Stepford Biden back on. But, those extreme levels, the way that information comes forward, you have to be careful of the way it sifts through back to us and what we have to say. All right. I'm going to read here from Jim Marrs. And I'm saying this, that I get support from my position that of JFK and the UFO file from one of the deepest of the deep state researchers, Jim Marrs here. And I know all the things that he told me about Riley Coffee Company that's incredible. You can't get a better education than sitting down and listening to 4 hours with Jim Marrs on the phone. And the man could talk, I will tell you this. All right. Oddly enough, 5 Riley Coffee employees, all of whom were in contact with Oswald, did join the NASA facility shortly after Oswald's departure. Former New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison came across these intriguing employment shifts during his ill-fated JFK assassination probe. Oswald left the coffee company July 19th, 1963, just a few weeks before he began his public show of handing out Fair Play for Cuba committee material. According to Garrison, Alfred Claude, the man who hired Oswald at Riley, went to work at Chrysler Aerospace Division of NASA in New Orleans facility. Emmett Barbie, Oswald's immediate superior at Riley, followed Claude to the NASA center in just a few days. And within a few weeks, they were joined by John Branyan and Dante Maracchini, both of whom worked with Oswald. Brandon and Maracchini also began aerospace careers in the New Orleans NASA Center. They have a coffee processing plant. Oswald says, I'm leaving to join NASA, which is weird enough. And then Garrison goes and looks for the other employees. They're gone too. And then he finds out, well, they all went and worked for NASA. The interface there between the aerospace companies and what they were doing is apparent even in the ownership of the Texas School Book Depository. As I've pointed out, LTV is an aerospace company. That's what they do. As a matter of fact, they're an experimental aerospace company. So when Oswald was showing up and punching the clock at the Texas School Book Depository, he's working for an experimental aerospace company. Keep that in mind. Aerospace is right at the heart of the whole thing. And of course, in the middle of the aerospace piece is the UFO file mystery. There's no way of getting around it. But there it is, right in the crossfire work of Jim Marrs. And then this quote will give us some idea or understanding of how this system, and it includes the Secret Service and COG, how this deep system could operate side by side with the regular system and be, to a certain level, undetectable. And this is from Professor Scott's Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. Quote, the deep politics paradigm, in contrast, attempts to go beyond all such restricted unified explanations. It is essentially an extension of conventional political investigative methods to consideration of a much larger field of evidence. That's what we do here on this program. including but not restricted to the unacknowledged processes and events which conventional decorum excludes from our current political science textbooks. By thus examining overt events in this larger field of deep political arrangement, it breaks down the distinction between overt and covert power, thereby hopefully avoids the frequently asked questions: which forces are in control, the public or the shadow powers? You see, they're operating side by side, and the covert piece you can't see because it is covert. When it leans into the public overt space, it causes a policy change, and then it withdraws, and we're left with all the rubble. Assassinations, the financial crash of 2008, where they were threatening, saying martial law is going to be here if you don't agree to give us $1 trillion. 9/11, they're set up on a certain level. They pull off the operation, and then they come afterwards and say, here's the policy change. And then the apparatus disappears back into the background, and we're stuck. We get Homeland Security. We get 250,000, more now, 260,000 people engaged in Homeland Security. And it seems like their main job is to surveil the American people. You see how this operates and how we get a better idea, or check in with that system. We get a better idea of the reality that's going on. And I like what Professor Scott does here, which is he says we're looking at a larger field of evidence. That's all that you need to do. So you don't need, very often there's fantasy material when you get outside of the regular media paradigm, right? So you have the actual media piece. I've done this before. I've explained dark journalism works something like this. You have the official story, which is there just to protect the institution of the government. The secondary story is put out by researchers, professors, writers, all these different people who can see that there's a psyop happening here. They question the official story. The same group that puts out the official story then comes up with the junk conspiracy. The junk conspiracy then overwhelms the second category, and people go back to the top one. So they go back to the official story because the other one gets too crazy, right? So once you go outside of the traditional expert, you're in kind of a Wild West scenario, supposedly. They can inject the junk conspiracy. This is the nature of what to watch out for. That's why when you get into alternative research, they've flooded it with things like flat Earth, because once they get you find yourself thinking outside the box, then that can be captured, or they can attempt to make the alternative research look ridiculous by injecting something false. So, the driver did it in the JFK case is the most classic thing. That was a complete CIA operation. And you can see that the junk conspiracy is the key thing in order for us to observe and avoid. And I think the last quote here, this is what Scott has to say. It also responds to those who object that no conspiracy to kill the president could have remained a secret for so long in a society as open as America's. We shall see that beneath the open surface of our society lies connections and relationships of long-standing, virtually immune to disclosure, and capable of great crimes, including serial murder. To the stock objection that it would be virtually impossible to assemble a murder conspiracy without leakage, the response is that an existing conspiratorial network or system of networks already in place and capable of this crime could have much less difficulty in maintaining the discipline of secrecy. That's the point. It's not a spontaneous crime. This is a system of crime. And I think Scott hit it on the head. And that book's from the 90s. His best book is American Deep State, and I think that's from 2010. So there's a rich degree of history, I think, in his work that I've pointed out. Miss Olivia, your last two questions here.
Okay, I'm gonna bundle these.
All right.
So Thomas Ball says, let's face it, we're all here to get intel to guess their next move. What do you think their next move is? Amarillo Gunrunner says, if we declare war or something like it, do they 25th Amendment Stepford Biden and start a Harris administration for real? Lisa Whaler says, do you believe the COG takeover is a possibility, as Trump is sure to win the election and then he has a possibility of a prison term?
Well, you have a few things going on here. First of all, like there's a number of things. The election is the showdown. And, a lot of people, even Elon Musk is engaged in a lot of this. How I feel very, very, I keep a very wary eye on all the Elon Musk stuff. But he was pushing Civil War this and Civil War that, right? And then you had this Rankin, this congressman, raising this thing. Well, because the Supreme Court didn't disqualify Trump when he wins the election, we're going to have to turn him back here in Congress, and then they'll have to get bodyguards for us, and we'll have Civil War conditions. He's rooting for this because he knows his candidate is set to lose. The people that are doing that are trying to put you into a false paradigm of Civil War. There's no reason for any Civil War with any of this. First of all, you've got the courts. One, compromised number of them are, but nonetheless, you have the courts. You've got the election process, as compromised as it is. If it's overwhelming a victory on the Republican side, you're not going to be able to fake it. You don't have COVID to do it this time. So there are a number of public pressure campaigns, a number of judicial opportunities, a number of election opportunities. And so before anyone gets I've heard irresponsible stuff on different shows talking about, I'm going to be in West Virginia, with my hoarding my goods and with a machine gun on top for anyone coming up the hill. Look, there are a number of things going on politically here. And what you can do is get the public focused on the fact that if they keep an open border, it collapses the country, because what it does is it takes people, one, who don't necessarily like the country. It's an easy load up for terrorists. It's all kinds of things. You can flow drugs into the country. But you also are putting a number of dependents on a fragile and crushing social security safety net. And you would literally collapse all of these cities. And somehow the Democrats are engaging on this. They want this. They want sanctuary cities. They want all these other things. And they want these people, because they can't govern normally, they want to install voters and replacements. So that's what they've been ordered to do. There's some entity that's controlling that. That's where you get Gavin Newsom. That's where you get Healy, our governor here in Massachusetts. All of these, the New York mayor, all that stuff is all lined up. And now on one hand, they're overwhelming that system. So somebody is making a bold charge, just like somebody made a bold charge when they tried to lock down the entire world during COVID. And this one group that wants to play it Wild West and says we can go directly in with the technology and the control we have now and do it. There's another group that's much more subtle that doesn't want to do it that way, still wants the control, but wants to do it in a subtle way where the public won't know what hits them. Those two groups, you see them battling it out. The psycho group is the one that was behind the assassination. They want everything to happen now. They want to, they'll engage in assassination. They'll go into World War III with Russia. They are, there's a level of insanity with it, but their plan is total domination, and I believe that group is going to implode because they are heading into overexposure through the Secret Service activity. If we can get people paying attention to the COG part of this, they'll definitely be overexposed. So just remember, there's a lot of options. There's a lot of positive outcomes that can happen here. It doesn't have to go into this. It might sound as a kind of a good punchline, click headline, Civil War, this and that. Elon Musk says Civil War or whatever. It's easy to sit up there with your $300 billion and, have wet dream fantasies of Civil War or whatever. And and make yourself a hero on Twitter. But, that's manipulative behavior. And at the same time, you can see there's a crumbling of the structure, and that the things coming out of the UK and the free speech restrictions have to be rejected. So we can't have a vice president like Tim Walz who embraces speech being, caged, and who eliminates free speech from the conversation and is against the Constitution. So, we get some idea there of what can take place in this country. The country at this point, you need to secure the border. You need to get the economy back. You need to get constitutional rule back. I say that you can get that back through the Trump administration now, because you don't have an option on the other side. That's the first step. And then that's a one-term solution, because Trump can't run for another term. So then in 2028, you're actually going to be back in the same scenario, but you need to restore constitutional rule. There's no question about it. Because the people who say that Trump is imperfect and Vance is imperfect and all the rest of it, they don't back Bobby either. So what do you got? Bobby can't get in anyway, but they're not backing him. So what does that leave? In fact, by default, they're supporting this Harris-Walz sickness. That's the truth. So we have to understand the nature of the situation that we're in. There can be a positive outcome, and there doesn't need to be a civil war. So don't get into that. Don't let them fool you on that. Don't believe the hype, as it were. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew. Secret Service Standown, assassination revealed. There's a lot more to come. I'm going to bring in more COG, Secret Service aspects as we're looking at this. Probably be looking at it all month. And Miss Olivia, you've got the final question, the final word. You're up.
Well, okay. David Termina says, DJ, 4D chess. Elon and Silicon Valley come to Trump's aid to stave off the insane left-wing deep state takeover, paving the way for the transhumanist, aka Eighth Sphere trap, to be set out of this chaos.
I think either side will engage, in the order of the day around the Eighth Sphere piece. The thing is that you have such an insanity coming out of the left with Harris and Walz that if you don't stop that, then you're going to get into probably a worldwide global war that will take place. And in the meantime, they'll be confusing people. And, they'll be like, this trans rights thing, that this fight over trans bathrooms is what the future is all about, and so they'll distract everybody into these phony fights, and then they'll have all these race baiting situations. Those things have nothing to do with what's going to take place in the future. But some people are looking at the tech bros, and it's funny because I'm going to tell you that there is something very interesting going on there. And this is what to keep an eye on, which is people like Teal and people coming from that end of the spectrum have some interesting fascination with the UFO file. Here's one of those headlines. I've got a story from it here. And it's true that Vance has had funding and interaction with the Teal group. Tons of people have. Can you imagine the dirty money flowing into the Democrat coffers right now? Think about it. Lockheed Martin. Does it get much dirtier than that? Here we go. Crypto bros, UFOs, and NFTs inside Peter Thiel's Senate fundraising tours. Why is UFOs in there? Why? That has to be answered. You have to get the UFO file into these conversations. The people who run around and are just, oh, I'm anti-Vance because he's into Peter Thiel. You've got to understand, find out why the UFO file is part of Thiel's pitch. This is important. This is going to be key. Here's part of that article. You ready? The conversations are unlike these fundraisers, are unlike those that typically take place at political fundraisers. While the 2016 and 2020 elections, policy towards China has been discussed, a range of other topics have arisen, including cryptocurrency, robotics, and UFOs. The UFO file is right in the heart of this. There have been discussions about deep fakes, the manipulation of digital media, and Jeffrey Epstein, the financier, convicted sex offender, who in 2019 was found dead in his jail cell. The connection to Teal has helped Masters and Vance, J.D. Vance, raise sums from first-time donors and those in California's tech community, which is typically reluctant to get behind Republican candidates. According to his campaign's financial records, Masters, who's this other guy that they're talking about here, raised $371,000 from contributors in the third quarter. Donors who want to get to know Teal, they want to understand what makes him tick. They want to understand who he is and spend time with him, said Lanson Chen, a candidate for state control in California who's met with Teal and, like the tech investor, has taught at Stanford. What they're going to find out is part of the plan here that's going on in the background with Teal is related to the UFO file. And why Teal may be trying to get a foot in the door with Trump is because Trump, with Space Force, laid the foundation for control or possession of the UFO file from the deep state under the executive branch. Wherever that UFO file goes, they follow. So you might find these people now coming into the Trump camp directly related to the UFO file. You have to, if you're going to understand the tech bro thing, bringing in the UFO side, you have to answer the question, why? And that's going to be a crucial piece getting into the 2024 election. And remember this, when you look and you find Cheney, Liz Cheney in this case, going around trying to make sure that Trump doesn't get in and giving these interviews and the media giving her the time of day, she's the representative of COG. Her dad crafted the new version of it. So that's why you get a low-level person who can't get 30% of the vote out there talking to all these major outlets, because in the background, this COG structure built back then, what's the final goal of COG? It's takeover. They want the emergency powers to do it. That's the thing to keep an eye on. And remember the UFO file piece coming up with that. And with that, Miss Olivia, oh, you know what? I have one last thing to read.
Okay,
and then, but your question, what do you got?
I just wanted to throw this out here because things are feeling dark, scary. That Get Smart said, I think praying helps a lot. And it's simple.
I agree.
And it's true. And, no matter what happens, we still have that. We'll always have that.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. No, there's a lot of providence moving through all these situations. And in World War II, things were looking pretty dark too. All right. Just a last little piece on Louis B. Sims. A man who would have taken a bullet for 6 American presidents will address Southwestern Oklahoma State University Friday, May 7th. This is 2010. Sims died shortly after. Hobart resident Louis B. Sims, a 20-year veteran of the Secret Service, the organization assigned to protect the President of the United States, will deliver the 2010 SWOSU commencement address at 7 p.m. Born and raised in Hobart, Sims once attended SWOSU in Weatherford on a partial athletic scholarship. After spending 3 years as a special agent for Army intelligence, Fort Holabird, Sims joined the Secret Service in '61, where he served 6 U.S. presidents, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan. Some of Sims' most vivid memories include President Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Secret Service protection beginning for presidential candidates immediately after Robert Kennedy's assassination, 3 trips to Vietnam during the war to set up security for the vice president and others, and the Watergate scandal that forced Nixon's resignation in '74. During the Nixon years, Sims oversaw the White House taping system. This led to his testifying before Judge John Sirica, the U.S. District Court Chief Judge who presided over the Watergate trials, regarding the method of recording and storage of the infamous Watergate tapes. Watergate did not affect me one way or the other, Sims said. I was in no way embarrassed. I simply testified in federal court what I knew, and that was it. Emotion was very seldom involved in my work or my decisions. Shortly after Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford, was sworn into office, Sims was promoted to Chief of International criminal police organization Interpol for the United States, where he spent 5 years. Sims was later transferred to the Office of Inspection of the Secret Service, where he remained until his retirement in 1981. This guy moved through the various levels of the deep state, but it's interesting on this Watergate anniversary to reflect on the fact that had it not been Sims, had Nixon had somebody else there, then the whole revelation of the tapes and the way that that all played out and how Sirica was able to obtain the tapes so easily and bring the Nixon administration down with the tapes, we can lay that at the feet of John Dean and Louis B. Sims, and they're both deeply connected to the COG apparatus and Secret Service piece we've been talking about. And with that, Miss Olivia, your super chatters are up.
Could you do something else for a minute?
I can show this piece, which is, I pointed out before, when we get into the JFK file records, the person we're looking at there who created the Oswald operation is George Joannides. The records that are supposed to come out don't even include Joannides' records. That's a separate case that Jefferson Morley brought. It is those records that the CIA needs to cough up, because there we will see that the CIA created the Oswald project. That's crucial. And I would say probably the last piece on all this is when we recall that Secret Service Standown. There's a number of videos about it, but, you know, clearly the agent knew something was amiss as he was being called off the back of the limousine. And that should tell us all a great deal about what took place in Dallas in 1963, but what took place in Butler, Pennsylvania with the Trump assassination plan. It is a Secret Service Standown bookended 61 years with the same goal and with the same secret forces operating inside of these different institutions. So, and honestly, with the same lame excuses about the patsy and all these various things related to the case, including the fact that, oh, we think he did it himself. Yeah, he outmaneuvered the entire Secret Service. Nicely done. Miss Olivia, your super chatters.
Okay,
You got
my
it.
super chats.
You've
Hang
got
on
the
one second.
com.
Loading up. All right. Ilarmenine Bay, Ramblin' Lamb, Thermobsterful, Descat Brock, Mark Petrie, The Bikini Truther, Eurythmia's Fun, Jay Parsons, April Cooper, I think it's your birthday, happy birthday, Black Tie, Knitting Kitten, Jonathan McIntosh, Joseph Fabry, Just a Girl, Stephen Spencer D.O., Ralph Smart, Robert Scott, Roosevelt Media News, Amarillo Gunrunners, Debbie McAdoo, Dog Boy, Erica Swenson Elliott, C.A. Beverforden, Griffin Eagle 7, Peter Rabbit, Terry Doherty. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Wow, fantastic. We really appreciate your support. And to all our subscribers, thank you for helping us to do what we do. We couldn't do it without you. We will be back next week. Of course, we have some very exciting shows coming up for you this month, and we'll be doing a lot of investigative research around the Secret Service and the political situation coming up here in America. We know there's a series of debates now that are being planned after the, Trump the debater took Biden out in one debate. Let's see what will happen with these 3 debates that are scheduled now with Harris and Trump. That will set the tone quite a bit in September. And it seems to me the deep state doesn't want Trump to get past the finish line, and they'll do a great deal to obfuscate his path to the victory on Election Day, which is coming up in less than 90 days now. So there's no question 2024 is the year of the election. And I'll do a couple of shout outs before we split here. We've got, I'm going to go back here. Kate Garcia. Thank you. Thomas Ball. Ted Rubenstein. Ivan Langley. Great to see you. Najat Madri, stay calm in the eye of the storm. I agree. Of course, Joseph's out there. It's great to see you, sir. We're going to talk very soon. YouTube won't let me super chat, but you guys should stream on Rumble. Yeah, you're going to see us more.
We may have to.
You're going to see us more and more everywhere. John Dean is still alive. That's correct. Antisocial. Yeah. Joseph Tugas, Scarlet Fire, James Hadaway. Let's see what else we got here. Who's got some good comments that we can highlight? Good night, all. Brenda Fisher. It's great to see you. Harris didn't show up for the last debate. That's true. Nick Malone. A Golden Girl. Best show on the interwebs. That's the one. Be situationally aware always. Indeed. I totally agree. Roosevelt, you blew me away tonight, DJ and Olivia. Remember, don't let them divide us. Absolutely. Thank you. It's good to see you out there, sir. And I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Now, Ted Rubenstein, there's a famous researcher, Ted Rubenstein. And I'm just wondering if you are the same Ted Rubenstein I'm thinking of. Eric Elander, John Matthews, Shelley Penn. Either way, it's great to have you here with us, Ted. Let's see. Of course, yes, Miss Olivia did a great job. She needs a bonus. Congratulations, Scarlet Fire. Happy birthday, DJ. Well, it's not my birthday. Who are you saying happy birthday to? Thank you very much. April. It's April's birthday. Yeah, my birthday was back in May there. Thank you very much, though. I appreciate that. Will Harris win? Well, not if her terrible record and that of the Democrat regime are put across to the public properly. But Harris may have a few tricks up her sleeve. She may get rid of Waltz because Waltz is getting into a lot of trouble with this stolen valor thing about saying, hey, I was deployed to all these places when he wasn't, and juicing up his National Guard record, which he didn't have to do because the National Guard is plenty good on its own. Bravo, Olivia, says Richard Adams. Happy birthday, April. Who is April again, though?
April Cooper.
April Cooper. Well, happy birthday, April. It's great to have you here. Let's see. Nobody will keep his promises. Vote nobody. Be hermit. That's great. Someone says Olivia should get $10,000 per show.
I got a lot of compliments here. Somebody said I should be the voice of Siri. I would love that.
Oh, look at this. Ted Rubenstein, JFK assassination researcher. You, Ted, if I have this correct, were actually a very young reporter trading information with Mae Brussel on JFK way back in maybe 1987, somewhere like that. That's amazing, extraordinary, and it is great to have you here as someone who has followed that research wave that comes out of the assassination research and how that really forms a lot of the foundation of independent media. So thank you very much for being here. Thomas Ball. Everybody's about money tonight. Show me the money. I like that. Hey, listen, if you want to, support the program, I'm not stopping you. That's for sure. But it's great to have everyone here. DJ's reporting is priceless. Number 6. Thank you, number 6. I truly appreciate that. That's a great little icon too. What a fantastic ideas room tonight. Really fantastic. It's great to see so many of you out there. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you all next Friday. And remember, never let it be forgot that once there was a Camelot and there can be again. And we might be looking at the setup for that in this election. I want to end the program by restating again. No, Rogan did not. He did not endorse RFK Jr. And, RFK is a great guy, but this 2024 is not the election for him this time, but we'll be looking for him. Wait for 28, I think, should be his hashtag. And I think he should throw his support behind Trump to get rid of the horrible Democrat Harris regime. So we need to really boot that regime.
Happy Hermit 3D says, I identify as a citizen of Camelot. Love it.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us. And of course, it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends. And we'll see you all next week.
God bless everybody.
Have a great weekend.